There is something quietly unusual about the way The Simpsons handles its own rules. Not the big theories, not the comas or the radiation or the conspiracies buried under decades of callbacks. Something simpler and, in a way, more interesting. The show has a set of internal agreements with the audience, agreements about how the world works, about who these people are, about what is and is not possible inside Springfield. And across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, the show has broken those agreements so many times, in so many different ways, that keeping track of them starts to feel like a full-time occupation. This is not a script about bad writing. That distinction matters, because a lot of what gets called a continuity error in The Simpsons is actually something more subtle. Some of these breaks are deliberate. The writers knew exactly what they were doing. Some are the natural consequence of a show that has been running longer than most of its current audience has been alive, with dozens of different writing rooms and creative teams cycling through over the decades. And some are genuinely unexplainable moments where the show contradicts itself so precisely, so unnecessarily, that you wonder if someone was testing something. Taken one at a time, most of these moments are easy to dismiss. You see a detail that doesn't match a previous episode and you move on. The next joke arrives and you forget about it. But when you line them all up together, when you sit with the full weight of what the show has done to its own internal logic across 3.5 decades, a different picture starts to emerge. Springfield is not a place where rules apply the same way twice. And tonight, that is exactly what we are going to explore. The Simpsons began on the 17th of December, 1989. It was a spin-off of short animated segments that had been airing on The Tracey Ullman Show since 1987. The characters were rougher then. Homer's design was barely recognizable compared to what he would eventually become. Bart was the star, the cultural phenomenon, the kid whose face ended up on t-shirts and lunchboxes and the covers of national magazines before the show had even finished its first season. The early episodes were grounded in a way that the show would slowly drift away from as the years went on. They dealt with recognizable family problems: money, school, marriage, the particular humiliation of being a parent who is just barely holding things together. The rules of that early Springfield were fairly clear. Homer worked at the nuclear plant. He was not good at it, but he was not a cartoon figure, yet he was recognizably a frustrated, middle-aged man doing a job he had never particularly wanted. Marge held the household together with a kind of patient competence that bordered on sainthood. Bart pushed every boundary the show would allow. Lisa played her saxophone and worried about things that nobody else in the family thought to worry about. Maggie sat in the background, watching. The world made a certain kind of sense. And then, gradually, it stopped making sense. Not all at once. The drift was slow enough that most viewers barely noticed it happening. One season, the show would add a detail about Homer's past that didn't quite fit with what had been established before. Another season, it would contradict something specific, a name, a date, a relationship in a way that the story required but the internal logic didn't support. Over time, these small fractures accumulated into something larger. The Simpsons has a relationship with its own continuity that is unlike almost any other long-running show in television history, partly because it has been running for so long, partly because it has always been a comedy first, and comedies have always been granted more flexibility with internal consistency than dramas, but also partly because the show operates according to a philosophy that was established very early and has shaped every creative decision since. That philosophy, articulated by the show's creators and writing staff many times over the years, is essentially this: the joke always wins. If there is a funnier version of a scene that requires ignoring something established in a previous episode, the funnier version wins. If a story would land harder with a slightly different version of a character's background, the story uses the version it needs and files the original away without comment. The show's writers have always treated internal consistency as a guideline rather than a law, a preference rather than an obligation. This is a reasonable approach for a comedy. Most successful comedies work this way, but The Simpsons has been doing it for so long and at such scale that the accumulated weight of these decisions has created something genuinely remarkable. A show that has contradicted itself so thoroughly, across so many dimensions, that trying to construct a coherent, consistent version of Springfield's history is essentially impossible. Consider what that actually means. Every episode of The Simpsons is, in some sense, its own island, its own self-contained story that happens to use these familiar characters in this familiar setting. The episodes are related to each other. They share a world, they share relationships, They share a general sense of who these people are, but they are not chapters in a continuous narrative, the way a drama series would be. They are more like short stories that happen to feature the same cast. The problem is that over time, those short stories have accumulated so many specific details, dates, names, events, relationships, backstories that they cannot all be true at the same time. Not all of them can coexist in a single, coherent version of Springfield. The show has told you Homer's birth year multiple times and given a different answer each time. It has established Bart's middle name in one episode and used a different one in another. It has shown characters who were dead come back without explanation and then disappear again without comment. It has, in short, broken its own rules so many times that the rules themselves have become a kind of fiction, a story the show tells about itself that does not quite match what is actually on the screen. And that is what makes this worth spending time with. Because the pattern of how the show breaks its rules is itself revealing. The breaks cluster around certain characters more than others. They tend to happen in certain kinds of episodes. They follow a logic, not the internal logic of Springfield, but the external logic of what the show needs to be in any given moment. Understanding that logic tells you something about what The Simpsons has always been, underneath the jokes and the callbacks and the couch gags. It tells you that Springfield is not a place with a history. It is a place with a mood, a feeling, a collection of emotional impressions that the show has been refining and adjusting for 36 years without ever fully committing to the version of the story that all those adjustments would ultimately require. The show has gotten away with this because its audience is patient and its humor is sharp enough that most viewers never stop to ask the structural questions. When the laugh comes, the question dissolves. But on a quiet night, with nowhere particular to be, when the episodes are washing over you one after another and your attention is drifting toward sleep, the questions have a way of surfacing. Why does this character not remember that? Why does that event have no consequences? Why does this piece of history not match the piece we were told in an earlier season? The answers are never supernatural. They are not the result of radiation or comas or collective denial, though all of those frameworks are interesting ways to think about what is happening. The answers are simpler and more human. Someone in a writer's room needed a scene to work and found a way to make it work. On the version of Springfield that existed before that decision was quietly set aside. But the cumulative effect of 1,000 decisions like that, made over 36 years, is something that deserves to be looked at carefully. Not with anger. Not with the particular frustration of the continuity purist who needs every detail to align. But with genuine curiosity about what it reveals. About the show, about the characters, about the strange, warm, complicated relationship between a television program and the audience that has refused to leave it for longer than most television shows last. So, settle in. Find a comfortable position. The light can stay low. We are going to go through every major way the show has broken its own rules. Section by section, character by character. We are going to look at what was established, what was contradicted, and what the contradiction tells us about the version of Springfield the show was trying to build at any given moment. The Simpsons has been telling stories about this family for 36 years. Tonight, we are going to tell the story of the stories, the version underneath the version, the Springfield that exists in the gaps between what the show says and what the show shows. It is a quieter Springfield than the one on the screen, a stranger one, and in its strangeness it might be the truest one of all. Let us begin. The first thing worth establishing is what a rule actually means in the context of a long-running animated show. Because the word rule gets used loosely when fans talk about continuity, and it is worth being precise about the different kinds of rules that The Simpsons has broken across its run. There are factual rules, specific details the show has established as true within Springfield's universe. Homer's age, the year he was born, the name of his childhood pet. These are the things that can be checked against specific scenes from specific episodes, and when a later episode contradicts them, the contradiction is clean and observable. There are character rules, established aspects of who someone is, how they behave, what they want, what they are capable of. These are softer but arguably more important. When Homer does something that seems fundamentally unlike the Homer we have been watching for 200 episodes, that is a different kind of rule break than a mismatched date in a flashback. There are relationship rules, the understood dynamics between characters that have been built up over years of episodes. The specific texture of Homer and Marge's marriage. The particular way Bart and Lisa navigate being simultaneously rivals and the only people who truly understand each other. The strange, layered relationship between Homer and Mr. Burns, which contains multitudes that the show has never fully sorted out. And there are world rules, the physical and logical constraints of Springfield itself, the geography, the laws of cause and effect, the question of whether Springfield operates according to anything like the rules of the actual world, or whether those rules are suspended whenever the story requires. All four types of rules get broken in The Simpsons. All four types get broken repeatedly, across decades, in ways that range from barely noticeable to genuinely dizzying. What is interesting is that the breaks are not random. There is a pattern to when the show abandons which type of rule and why. Factual rules tend to get broken in service of backstory episodes, moments where the writers need a specific history for a character that turns out not to match the history already established. Character rules tend to get broken in high-concept episodes where the premise requires Homer or Bart or whoever to behave in ways that the standard version of those characters would not support. Relationship rules tend to get broken in emotional episodes where the story needs the characters to start from a different place than where they have been left. World rules are the most interesting of all, because the breaks there are the most revealing. The moments when Springfield's physical reality stops making sense are the moments when you can see the show's priorities most clearly. What the writers care about preserving and what they are willing to sacrifice for the sake of a scene. We are going to move through all of it, slowly, thoroughly, with enough time spent on each break to understand not just what happened, but why, and what it tells us about the show that has been quietly reorganizing its own rules for 36 years. This is a long night's work, but then again, the show has had 36 years to accumulate it. We might as well be comfortable. Drop a comment right now with where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. Could be midnight on a Tuesday in a city no one has heard of, or early morning with a coffee before the rest of the house wakes up. Every location is interesting, and if you have not subscribed yet, take a second and do that now. It means a lot and it keeps this kind of content going. Of all the rules The Simpsons has ever broken, the ones involving Homer Simpson's physical existence are the most numerous, the most spectacular, and the most casually delivered. Homer's body has been treated as indestructible in ways that the show occasionally acknowledges and usually does not. He has survived things that would end most action movie protagonists, let alone a middle-aged nuclear safety inspector with a fondness for donuts and an IQ the show's own creator has placed at around 55. And what makes this fascinating from a continuity standpoint is not that the show lets Homer survive impossible things. Comedy has always had a flexible relationship with physical reality. What makes it fascinating is the specific, inconsistent rules the show applies to Homer's survival at different moments and how those rules contradict each other in ways that add up, over time, to a portrait of a man whose body operates on principles the show has never fully worked out. Let us start with Homer's skull, because it is possibly the most contested piece of real estate in Springfield. The skull has two competing canonical histories. In one version of Homer's story, a crayon was lodged in his brain during childhood, pushed up his nose in a moment of childish curiosity, and somehow never removed, slowly, physically reducing his cognitive function from what might have been genuine intelligence to the foggy, distracted, impulsive version of Homer that the show presents as its baseline. This is established in the season 12 episode HOMR, and it is played as revelation. The crayon explains Homer. It is the key to the mystery of why a man who occasionally demonstrates flashes of genuine competence is mostly unable to function at an adult level. But here is where the rule breaks. The crayon theory implies a specific physical reality about Homer's skull, that there is foreign material lodged in his brain, that his cognitive function has been reduced by its presence, and that removing it would restore a different version of Homer. All of that is shown to be true within the episode. Homer gets the crayon removed. His IQ climbs to 105. He becomes thoughtful, articulate, and miserable in a way that is one of the show's better meditations on intelligence and belonging. Then he puts it back. But across other episodes, spanning the show's entire run both before and after this revelation, Homer's skull is treated as practically indestructible in ways that the crayon and the brain detail make stranger. Homer has been hit on the head with enough force to knock out a professional boxer, fallen from great heights and landed on his skull, been run over by vehicles, and survived each incident with no lasting neurological effect beyond the ones he already had. The crayon established that something as small as a piece of children's art supplies can permanently alter his brain function, and yet the show's broader treatment of his skull suggests it is made of something considerably more durable than the standard human cranium. This is not a minor detail. The show spent an entire episode establishing the specific mechanics of Homer's brain damage, and the physical reality that episode requires is incompatible with the physical reality that dozens of other episodes require. The crayon Homer cannot also be the Homer who takes a bowling ball to the face and blinks. Unless he can, and maybe that is the more interesting possibility, because the crayon is not the only structural intervention Homer's brain has experienced. In Treehouse of Horror, episodes which the show designates as non-canonical and in regular episodes that blur the line, Homer's head has been opened, emptied, refilled, compressed, expanded, and treated as a hollow object on multiple occasions. The show has made jokes about the size of Homer's skull, the contents of Homer's skull, and the amount of empty space within Homer's skull across dozens of episodes. These are different registers of joke, some in the same episode as genuinely emotional content about his intelligence, and the show treats them as simultaneously true, which they cannot be. Then there is the weight question. Homer's weight has been a recurring element of the show since its earliest seasons. He is canonically overweight. This is established visually, referenced in dialogue, and used as the premise of multiple plotlines. The specific number has varied. In some episodes, the show quotes a precise figure. In others, it implies something different through jokes or physical gags. But across the show's run, Homer's weight has been used to establish two entirely contradictory things at different moments. In episodes focused on Homer's health or his relationship with food, his weight is a genuine vulnerability. It affects his heart. His doctor expresses concern. There are moments where the show treats Homer's physical condition as something that has real medical consequences and will eventually catch up with him in ways that matter. These episodes establish a rule. Homer's body is subject to the same physical laws as everyone else's, and years of donuts and beer and physical inactivity have accumulated in ways that are going to matter. In episodes focused on Homer's physical capability or comedic resilience, the weight becomes an asset or a non-factor. Homer runs. Homer climbs. Homer engages in physical activities that his established body type should make essentially impossible. He outruns people who are demonstrably more athletic than him. He takes falls that his weight and the angle of impact should make catastrophic. The show does not pretend he is athletic. It actually derives humor from the contrast between his capabilities and his body, but it consistently allows him to do things that the medical consequence episodes say his body cannot do. The two versions of Homer's physicality operate in the same show, across the same decades, sometimes within the same season, and the show has never resolved them because it does not need to. Each version of Homer is useful in its own context. The vulnerable, health-compromised Homer creates emotional stakes. The surprisingly capable, indestructible Homer creates comedy. Both are true when the episode needs them to be. This becomes most visible in the accumulated catalog of injuries Homer has survived over the course of the series. It is not just that he survives things that should kill him. It is that the show is inconsistent about which things are survivable and which things leave lasting damage. In some episodes, a relatively minor physical incident leaves Homer with consequences that carry over into later scenes within that same episode. The show takes seriously the idea that this specific thing happened to this specific body and will have an effect. In other episodes, Homer experiences trauma that would kill most animals, let alone people, and the next scene has him eating cereal as if nothing happened. The inconsistency is not random. It follows the emotional logic of what the story needs. When an episode wants to build sympathy for Homer, his body becomes vulnerable and the consequences are real. When an episode wants to generate energy and movement, his body becomes a cartoon object that follows cartoon physics and the consequences evaporate. Both choices are valid within the context of individual episodes. The problem, the rule break, is that they are both presented as the same Homer in the same body in the same world. The show cannot have both a Homer whose physical damage accumulates meaningfully and a Homer who can fall off a cliff and turn up at breakfast unscathed, and it has both anyway. Homer's relationship with alcohol adds another dimension to this. The show has established, across dozens of episodes, that Homer is a consistent and heavy drinker. This is not presented as a problem to be solved, with a few notable exceptions that the show then walks back, but as a fundamental aspect of his character. Homer drinks beer the way other people drink water. The Duff Brewery is Springfield's most important commercial enterprise after the nuclear plant, and Homer is arguably its best customer. But the show's treatment of what Homer's drinking means for his body has shifted dramatically across seasons. In early episodes, there are moments that acknowledge the cumulative effect of years of heavy drinking on a middle-aged man's liver and general health. These moments are played carefully, not as very special episode content, but as quietly realistic details in a comedy. There is weight to them. The show treats Homer's drinking as something with actual stakes. Then those stakes dissolve. Not in a single episode, but gradually, as the show's priorities shifted and Homer's drinking became more cleanly comedic than complicated. The health implications recede. The accumulated damage of decades of consistent heavy drinking simply does not appear in the version of Homer that later seasons present. He is still a heavy drinker. The consequences of that drinking are just not present. The rule was established and then quietly discontinued, in the way that the show has discontinued so many rules, not with a retcon or an explanation, but simply by the next episode beginning without reference to what the previous one established. Homer's hands deserve specific attention because they are the site of one of the show's most quietly persistent rule breaks. Every character in The Simpsons has 4 fingers. This is the animation standard for the show, a design choice inherited from the traditions of cell animation, where the 4-fingered hand was simpler to draw and animate consistently. Within the show's universe, 4 fingers is the norm for Springfield residents. 4 fingers is just what hands look like. Except for God, who in the episode where Homer has a face-to-face conversation with the divine has 5 fingers. This is a deliberate detail the creators have confirmed it was intentional, a visual signal that God exists outside the rules that govern Springfield. 5 fingers means not from here. 4 fingers means Springfield. But then celebrity guest characters appear with the same 4-fingered hands as Springfield residents, despite the established logic suggesting that people from outside Springfield should look different. And then, in various episodes, Springfield residents appear with hands that seem to have a different number of fingers, depending on the angle of the shot or the requirements of a specific physical gag. The 4-finger rule is one of the show's most visually fundamental rules, and it is also one that gets quietly bent whenever the animation requires it. Most viewers never notice because individual frames pass too quickly, and we are trained by years of watching to accept the visual convention without scrutinizing it. But when you look closely, the rule is softer than it appears. Homer's voice is another rule that has been bent across the show's run, though this one is easier to explain and less revealing about the show's internal logic. Dan Castellaneta's performance of Homer has evolved significantly from the early seasons to the present, and the character's vocal register has shifted in ways that reflect both the actor's development and the writing's changing sense of who Homer is. The early Homer was drier, more understated, capable of a kind of weary sincerity that later seasons used less. The later Homer is broader, more operatically stupid, more willing to go to extremes. These are not rule breaks in the factual sense. Voice acting changes over time and audiences accept this. But they represent a character rule break in the more interesting sense. The Homer who exists now is not quite the same person as the Homer who existed in Season 2, and the show has never acknowledged the transition. It simply happened, gradually, and the audience followed. Which brings us to what is perhaps the most significant rule. Homer's existence breaks across the show's run. The rule about consequences. The early seasons of The Simpsons treated Homer as a character whose choices had consequences. Not dramatic, life-altering consequences in most cases. This was and always will be a comedy, but legible cause and effect relationships between what Homer did and what happened as a result. He made a bad decision. The bad decision led to a specific result. The episode resolved around Homer, sometimes barely, sometimes unexpectedly, finding his way to some kind of better outcome, and occasionally the resolution had real emotional weight. This is a rule about how stories work and what kind of character Homer is within those stories. He is not immune to consequence. His choices matter in a comprehensible way. Then the show began running episodes where Homer's choices lead to consequences that evaporate before the credits roll, or consequences that are catastrophic enough to be genuinely funny, but resolve in ways that reset him back to the starting position. The consequence begins to feel cosmetic, a dramatic element that the episode deploys to generate tension or emotion, but does not actually commit to in a way that affects the character going forward. This is the rule break that accumulates most painfully over time. Not any single instance of Homer doing something that should have a lasting effect and not having one. But the slow accumulation of those instances across decades until the pattern is undeniable. Homer Simpson is a character who has experienced enough consequence-free catastrophe to fill a dozen other characters' lifetimes, and each individual moment is forgivable. It is the total, the aggregate, the sum of 3.5 decades of resets that becomes something you cannot explain away with cartoon logic alone. The show established Homer as someone consequences apply to, and then it built 36 years of episodes on top of that establishment while slowly unwinding the rule that made the establishment meaningful. His body survives what bodies cannot survive. His history rewrites itself to match each new story. His weight and health exist in perpetual contradiction. His intelligence fluctuates across episodes in ways the crayon explanation makes both more and less coherent. His drinking leaves no lasting damage. His catastrophic decisions leave no lasting trace. Homer Simpson's body is not just impossible, it is a rule-breaking machine. A site where the show's competing needs for comedy, for emotion, for flexibility, for consistency collide and resolve every single episode in favor of whatever the current moment requires. And somehow, despite all of this, he is the most recognizable fictional character in American television history. Maybe that is part of the explanation. Homer's rule-breaking body is also, in a strange way, what makes him universally legible. Any version of Homer is Homer. The fat Homer and the surprisingly agile Homer. The vulnerable Homer and the indestructible Homer. The smart Homer, with the crayon removed, and the Homer who cannot figure out how a door works. We recognize all of them because we have spent 36 years with all of them. The contradiction is not a flaw in the character. It might be the character. A man so fundamentally himself that he can contain all of these mutually exclusive physical and cognitive realities without becoming incoherent. Or it might just be a very long-running show that needed Homer to be different things at different times. Both are probably true. Springfield has the worst collective memory of any fictional community in the history of television. That is not an exaggeration. Other long-running shows deal with continuity issues, with events from earlier seasons being quietly ignored or contradicted by later ones. This is a universal feature of episodic storytelling at scale. But The Simpsons has done something that goes beyond standard continuity slippage. It has built forgetting into the architecture of its world. Springfield does not just occasionally fail to remember things. It systematically, comprehensively, and with what begins to feel like intentionality, treats every significant event as if it never happened by the time the next episode begins. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has experienced natural disasters, financial collapses, political upheavals, alien encounters, or things that looked very much like alien encounters, and the literal blocking of the sun by a billionaire who wanted to force residents to buy his electricity. And every single time, by the following episode or the following season at the latest, none of it has left a mark. The crater is filled. The dome is gone. The sun is back. Mr. Burns is still running the plant and Homer is still showing up to work, and the town is still, in some fundamental sense, exactly the way it was before the catastrophe that was supposed to change everything. This is a rule being broken in slow motion. The rule is simple. Events have lasting consequences in the world where they occur. It is the most basic rule of storytelling and of physical reality. Things that happen leave marks. The world after a catastrophe is not identical to the world before it. Springfield ignores this rule constantly, comprehensively, and this is the part worth thinking about in ways that follow their own consistent pattern even within the breaking. Let us talk about what actually gets forgotten and what, occasionally, does not. The Simpsons movie exists in an interesting relationship to this pattern. The film ends with Springfield having been literally domed by the EPA, Homer having inadvertently caused the environmental crisis that made the doming necessary, the town having escaped the dome through a combination of Bart's skateboarding and Springfield's residents working together, and the dome having been destroyed by a bomb. The physical Springfield at the end of the film is structurally very different from the physical Springfield at the beginning of the film, and the relationship between Springfield's residents and Homer is very different from what it was. And the relationship between Homer and his family has been tested and repaired in ways that should leave a lasting impression. The film came out in 2007. Season 18 was airing at the time. and the episodes that followed the film's release essentially treated it as if it had not happened, not with a single line acknowledging the events and moving on, with the show simply continuing as if those events had not occurred, set in a Springfield that looked and functioned exactly as it had before the film. Homer's relationship with the town, which the film had dramatically altered, returned to its previous state, the physical damage to Springfield resolved without explanation. This is the clearest possible example of the forgetting principle in action. The show made a major theatrical film that explicitly changed its world, and then the show continued as if the world had not changed. But here is where the pattern gets more interesting than simple forgetting. Because some things from the film did carry over into later episodes, specific character details, references to events, things that happened between Homer and Marge, the forgetting was not total. It was selective. Certain elements of the film's story were retained and others were dropped, and the selection appears to follow the rule that what gets kept is what is emotionally useful to future stories, and what gets dropped is what is structurally inconvenient. The same selective forgetting applies to the show's episodic catastrophes. When Springfield's elementary school loses its funding, the funding crisis can disappear between episodes without reference. When a major character dies and the show has killed several major characters in ways that were presented as permanent, the death's consequences for other characters tend to fade within a few episodes, unless those consequences serve a specific story purpose. The most famous example is Maud Flanders. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed in season 11. The killing was not played for laughs. It was a genuine, if quickly established, death that the show committed to in the sense that Maud did not come back. She stayed dead. In that respect, the show broke a different version of the forgetting rule. In a show where nothing has lasting consequences, Maud's death was allowed to be lasting. But the consequences of her death for Ned, for his children, for the Flanders family's relationship to the rest of Springfield, these consequences were honored with care in the immediate aftermath and then became gradually, steadily more muted, until Ned's grief became a character detail rather than a lived reality. This is not a criticism of the storytelling. It would be impossible to sustain acute grief as a dominant character note across hundreds of episodes. But the specific way the show has calibrated Ned's relationship to Maud's memory over the years, gradually adjusting it from raw loss to warm remembrance to occasional comedic reference, is itself a kind of forgetting. A slower, more careful forgetting than the town-level resets, but forgetting nonetheless. The town-level forgetting is different in character from the character-level forgetting, and it is worth distinguishing between them. Character-level forgetting is when a specific character fails to remember something that happened to them personally in a previous episode. Homer forgetting events from previous seasons is the most common version of this, though it applies to most of Springfield's cast at various points. This kind of forgetting is individually noticeable. You catch it when you recognize an episode and realize the character is behaving as if something has not happened. That definitely has, but it does not necessarily break world's internal logic in a deep way. Characters are allowed to have imperfect memories, especially in a comedy where the episode-to-episode continuity has always been loose. Town-level forgetting is different. This is when an event that is large enough, physical enough, and public enough that it should have permanently altered the landscape of Springfield simply does not appear in any subsequent episode. The sinkhole that swallowed the Springfield retirement castle in the Who Shot Mr. Burns setup. The giant crater left by a comet that was supposed to hit Springfield in the season 6 Halloween episode. The extensive physical damage done to the town in multiple other episodes across the series. These events should change what Springfield looks like. They should change what buildings exist, which roads are passable, which landmarks are still standing. And they do, within the episode in which they occur. Springfield is visibly different during the catastrophe. And then the next episode begins and the difference is gone. The physical Springfield has reset. The landscape has healed itself without comment or explanation. This is a world rule being broken, and it is being broken constantly. The rule is that places remember what has happened to them. Buildings that are destroyed stay destroyed until they are rebuilt. Craters that open in the earth remain until they are filled. The physical environment is a record of what has occurred in it. Springfield does not follow this rule. Springfield's physical environment resets between episodes in a way that is not explained and not acknowledged. What is interesting is how this connects to the show's emotional reality, because the forgetting is not random. The things Springfield remembers are the things that define its emotional character, the relationships between characters, the ongoing dynamics of the town's social world, the specific textures of who these people are to each other. The things Springfield forgets are the things that would, if remembered, make those ongoing dynamics impossible. If Springfield remembered every catastrophe that had befallen it, the town would be uninhabitable. If Ned Flanders remembered every awful thing that had happened to him in acute detail and lived accordingly, he could not function. If the nuclear power plant's accidents were all on record and genuinely investigated, Mr. Burns would be in prison and the town's economy would collapse. Springfield forgets what it needs to forget in order to keep being Springfield. The forgetting is not a flaw in the world's design. It might be the world's most essential feature. The show made this explicit in The Principal and the Pauper, the Season 9 episode where it turns out that Seymour Skinner is not who he has always claimed to be. When the truth about Skinner's real identity is exposed, the town does not accept it and move on. The town actively chooses to suppress it. They vote. They make the lie the official truth. They physically remove the man whose existence proves the lie from the community. And they make it legally forbidden to ever mention the truth again. That episode is usually discussed as a controversy, a divisive, creative choice that many fans felt was a mistake. But read through the lens of Springfield's memory problem. It is actually the show being more honest than usual about the mechanism behind the forgetting. In every other case, Springfield forgets passively, things simply do not appear in the next episode, and there is no explanation. In The Principal and the Pauper, Springfield forgets actively. It makes the decision to forget. It votes on forgetting. It enforces forgetting with legal and physical consequences. The episode shows you the machinery that runs invisibly in every other episode. The vote is usually off-screen. The decree is usually unspoken. The exile is usually just the absence of a reference in the next episode. But the mechanism is the same. Springfield forgets because forgetting is a choice, made collectively, every episode, in 100 small ways that add up to a town that has no continuous memory of its own history. Now consider what this means for the show's rules more broadly. If Springfield's memory does not work in a straightforward way, then the rules that depend on memory also do not work in a straightforward way. A character cannot be bound by rules they do not remember agreeing to. A town cannot be shaped by events it has chosen to forget. The logic of consequence and effect, which is the basic rule of how stories work and how worlds operate, depends on memory functioning reliably. If memory is optional, consequence is optional. And in Springfield, both of them have always been somewhat optional. This explains something that gets noticed a lot but not always examined carefully. The way long-running storylines in The Simpsons tend to resolve in ways that leave no mark on the characters' ongoing lives. Homer and Marge's marriage has been in genuine crisis multiple times across the show's run, real, dramatized crisis that the show played with emotional seriousness. These crises resolve, as they must in a comedy about a family that stays together, and then they are not referenced again. They do not inform the texture of the marriage in subsequent episodes. They do not add a layer of wariness or earned closeness to how Homer and Marge interact. The crisis happens, the resolution happens, and then the next episode begins with the marriage essentially where it started. This is the memory problem applied to emotional continuity. The characters do not remember, in a lived and embodied way, what they have been through together. They carry the general impression of a long relationship, a sense of history, a sense of familiarity, but not the specific accumulated weight of specific events. The Homer who watched Marge leave in one episode is the same Homer who seems surprised when she considers leaving in another 10 seasons later. It is not quite amnesia, because the characters do sometimes reference past events. Lisa will occasionally mention something that happened in a previous season. Bart will invoke a moment from the show's earlier history. The references prove that memory exists and is not entirely dysfunctional. But the references are selective in the same way that the town-level forgetting is selective. What gets remembered is what serves the current moment, and what gets forgotten is what would complicate the current moment. The most striking version of this selective memory might be Homer's relationship with Mr. Burns. By any reasonable accounting of what Homer knows and what Homer has experienced across the show's run, Homer should have a very specific, very complicated set of feelings toward his employer. Burns has fired Homer multiple times and rehired him. Burns has tried to have Homer killed on at least one occasion. Burns is the man who destroyed Homer's mother's life. This is canonical, established in Mother Simpson, and Homer learns it explicitly within that episode. Burns is the source of most of the worst things that have happened to Homer and his family across 3 decades of episodes. And Homer continues to work for Burns. He continues to interact with Burns in the same deferential, slightly fearful, occasionally resentful way that he has always interacted with him, without the accumulated weight of 3 decades of terrible experiences inflecting that interaction. The Homer who knows that Burns destroyed his mother does not carry that knowledge into his next encounter with Burns in a way that you can feel. This is the memory problem at its most revealing. It is not just that Homer forgets specific events. It is that the accumulated emotional truth of Homer's life with Burns, a truth that should be crushing, should be formative, should be the single most clarifying thing about Homer's relationship with the power structure of Springfield, has no consistent presence in how Homer behaves. He knows it when the show needs him to know it. He forgets it when the show needs him to forget it. Springfield forgets what it needs to forget. And the show, in its own way, has always counted on the audience doing the same. There is something almost collaborative about this. The audience that has watched The Simpsons for 36 years has, by necessity, developed the same selective memory as Springfield's residents. We remember the iconic moments. We remember the episodes that moved us. We carry a general impression of the show's emotional landscape, its warmth, its humor, its occasional capacity for genuine sadness. But we do not carry every specific detail in active, cross-referenced memory the way you would need to in order to catch all of the contradictions in real time. We forget what we need to forget to keep loving the show. And that is not a criticism of us or of the show. It is simply the reality of a long-term relationship with a piece of narrative art. You cannot love something for 36 years while holding every inconsistency and constant attention. The inconsistencies dissolve into the overall impression, and the overall impression is what remains. Springfield forgets. We forget. The show keeps going. It is its own kind of continuity. Not the continuity of a carefully maintained fictional world, but the continuity of a feeling, a mood, a place that exists in memory rather than in fact, and that is all the more durable for it. Marge Simpson has been married to Homer for 36 years, and her marriage has ended, threatened, reconsidered, nearly abandoned, and fully rebuilt so many times across those years that the remarkable thing is not that she stayed. The remarkable thing is that the version of Marge who stayed each time appears to be a slightly different person than the version who was threatened, and the show has never fully resolved the gap between them. Marge is the character the show has treated most carefully in some ways and most carelessly in others. Her emotional intelligence is the show's moral compass. She is the person whose reaction to events tells the audience how to feel about them, whose discomfort signals genuine wrongness, whose joy signals genuine warmth. When Marge is okay, Springfield is habitable. When Marge is in pain, the show's emotional temperature drops in a way it does not drop for any other character's suffering. And yet Marge is also the character whose internal rules have been most comprehensively rewritten across the show's run. The rules about who she is, what she wants, what she is capable of, and what her marriage means to her have shifted across seasons in ways that cannot all be simultaneously true, but that the show presents as continuous with each other. Let us start with the rewriting of her origin story, because it is the most literal version of the rule-breaking and therefore the easiest to see clearly. When The Simpsons began, Marge's history with Homer was anchored to a specific period. The flashback episodes from the early seasons placed their courtship in the late 1970s, consistent with their ages and the show's timeline. These episodes had a specific visual and cultural texture. The clothes, the music, the references were all specific to that era. Marge and Homer were high school sweethearts in the late 70s, and their early relationship had the particular flavor of that moment in American culture. This is a factual rule. The rule says, Marge and Homer's courtship happened at a specific time in a specific cultural context, and both of them lived through that specific era. But the floating timeline that keeps The Simpsons perpetually in their mid-30s has required that this rule be broken, quietly and repeatedly, as the decades have passed. If Marge is still in her mid-30s in 2025, she was not in high school in the late 1970s. She would have been in high school in the late 2000s, and episodes that flash back to Marge and Homer's youth have been adjusted accordingly across the show's later seasons. The cultural references shift, the music changes, the specific texture of their early relationship is updated to match whatever decade a character in their mid-30s would have grown up in at the time of each episode's broadcast. This means that Marge and Homer's origin story has been told and retold multiple times across the show's run, with each retelling moving the setting forward in time while keeping the emotional content essentially constant. The specific songs that played on the radio when they fell in love have changed. The specific movies they watched on their early dates have changed. The specific cultural moment their relationship was shaped by has changed. The emotional core has not changed. They still found each other. They still chose each other. The love story is the same love story, but the story keeps getting told in a different decade, and the Marge who grew up in each of those different decades is, in important ways, a different person with different formative experiences and different cultural reference points. The show treats these retellings as the same story, and in the broadest sense they are, but the specifics matter. The specific version of the world that shaped Marge shapes what she knows, what she assumes, what she finds beautiful or frightening or funny. The Marge who grew up in the 1970s and the Marge who grew up in the 2000s are not quite the same woman. Even if their emotional arc, the trajectory from that pretty girl who fell for the interesting, troubled boy in high school to the woman holding her family together in a complicated house on Evergreen Terrace follows the same path. The show has essentially told you that Marge's past is a story it is still writing, that the specific facts of her history are subject to revision whenever the floating timeline requires it. This is an honest admission, in its way, but it is also a rule break at the level of the character's fundamental identity. The rule that a person's past is fixed, that what happened to someone happened in a specific way at a specific time, is being quietly suspended whenever the timeline demands it. Then there is the rule about Marge's ambitions, which the show has broken in a different and perhaps more interesting way. Early Marge was a housewife who wanted things she could not fully name. The show handled this with some subtlety in its best early moments. Marge's dissatisfaction was present but not strident, visible but not the episode's entire point. She was a woman who had organized her life around her family's needs and who occasionally, briefly, glimpsed a different version of herself without the episode quite committing to what that version was. As the show developed, Marge's potential and ambitions became the subject of specific episodes. She tried careers, she painted, she worked at the nuclear plant, she joined the police force, she became a real estate agent. Each of these attempts at a professional identity outside her domestic role was given its own episode, its own arc, its own resolution. And the resolution was almost always the same. Marge finds out that whatever she tried was not quite right for her, or that the cost of pursuing it was too high in terms of what it took from her family, and she returns to Evergreen Terrace. The rule those episodes established is that Marge's primary identity is domestic, not because she lacks the capability for other things, but because her family is what she chooses, episode after episode, when the choice is made explicit. But the show has also, across those same years, run episodes that establish Marge as genuinely excellent at things that have nothing to do with domestic life. Her painting turns out to be startlingly accomplished. Her competence in professional contexts that the show drops her into is consistently higher than the episode's premise requires. Marge is not a person who failed to build a professional life because she lacked the ability. She is a person who did not build that life for reasons the show has never been fully able to articulate. And in the episodes that explore her dissatisfaction, which are some of the show's best episodes, the internal rules about what Marge wants shift in ways that are not always consistent with each other. In one episode, what Marge wants is creative expression. In another, what she wants is professional respect. In another, what she wants is simply to be seen clearly by the people closest to her. These are not the same thing, and a character who wants all of them in sequence across different episodes is not a character with a coherent inner life. She is a character whose inner life is being constructed to serve whatever story the episode needs to tell. This is the character rule break that matters most for Marge. The show has repeatedly told us what Marge wants, in terms specific enough to constitute a rule, and then in the next episode that she wants something different instead. The marriage itself is where the rule breaking becomes most visible, because the marriage is the show's most important ongoing relationship and therefore the site where the need for continuity is greatest. Homer and Marge's marriage has been an actual, dramatized crisis, not comedic conflict but genuine existential threat at a frequency that, if you added up the hours of television devoted to it, would suggest a relationship in permanent freefall. And the show has played these crises with real emotional commitment. These are not perfunctory, very special episode plots. They are stories that take seriously the possibility that this marriage might end, that Homer might have finally done the irreversible thing, that Marge might finally have reached the limit of what she is willing to absorb. The rule that gets broken each time is the rule about how those crises resolve. In a marriage that exists continuously, that carries its full history forward, with each new day, a genuine crisis leaves a mark. The relationship after the crisis is different from the relationship before it. The people in the marriage have changed through the experience of nearly losing what they have. They relate to each other differently. There is more care, or more wariness, or some new texture to how they inhabit the space between them. In Homer and Marge's marriage, the crises resolve, and then the marriage returns to approximately the position it was in before the crisis. Not exactly the same. The show is too emotionally intelligent to do a total reset every time, but close enough that the cumulative effect of multiple genuine crises is not the cumulative effect you would expect. The Homer who nearly lost Marge in Season 3 and the Homer who nearly lost Marge in Season 8 and the Homer who nearly lost Marge in Season 16 is still recognizably the same Homer, in a marriage that still feels essentially stable, suggesting that the crises have passed through the relationship without fully transforming it. This is the show's most difficult balancing act and the rule it breaks most consistently. Because it cannot allow the marriage to end, the show requires the family intact. It must resolve every crisis in a way that brings the marriage back from the edge. But by resolving every crisis in a way that returns the marriage to stability, it is implicitly arguing that the crises were survivable, which means they were not as serious as the show presented them. And if they were not as serious as presented, then the emotional investment the audience made in each crisis was based on a false promise. The show promises genuine stakes and delivers resolution. Every time, without fail. And the repetition of that pattern across 36 years means that by now, a viewer who has watched the show throughout its run will approach any episode that threatens the marriage with a baseline of confidence that it will be fine. The stakes have been diffused by repetition. This is a rule about narrative trust. The rule says, if you present something as genuinely threatening, the threat must be real enough that the resolution genuinely resolves it. Marge and Homer's marriage has been threatened enough times, and resolved enough times without the resolutions fully accounting for the damage of the threats, that the threat is no longer genuinely threatening. It has become a genre, a category of episode. The marriage in trouble episode, which follows known steps toward a known resolution. There is one specific rule break about Marge that the show has committed so consistently it deserves its own attention, the rule about her relationship with herself. In scattered moments across the series, the episodes that land closest to the emotional center of what the show can do at its best, Marge reveals a rich, complicated interior life. She has fears that she has never shared with Homer. She has wants that she has never been able to fully articulate. She has a relationship with her own identity that is more fraught and more interesting than the patient, competent homemaker that she presents to the world most of the time. These moments are real. They are among the best things the show has done, and they establish a rule. Marge's inner life is complex, her relationship with her domestic role is ambivalent, and the gap between what she projects and what she feels is a genuine source of meaning in the character. The rule that gets broken is that those moments are rarely honored in the episodes that follow them. The Marge who reveals something genuine about her inner life in one episode is the same Marge who appears to have no particular relationship to that revelation in the next one. The complexity that the show occasionally allows her to access does not accumulate into a consistently complex character. It flashes and fades. This might be the most genuine loss in the show's long-form rule-breaking history, not because the rule break damages the narrative in a technical sense, but because Marge is genuinely interesting in those moments when the show lets her be fully herself, and the systematic forgetting of those moments, the return of the plot-functional Marge, who exists to hold the story together rather than to have her own story, feels like a missed opportunity on a large enough scale to matter. Marge deserves the continuous version of herself that the show occasionally reveals. The show has, 36 years in, not quite found a way to give it to her consistently. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. He has been in the 4th grade for 36 years. He has sat at the same desk in Mrs. Krabappel's classroom, endured the same dynamic with Principal Skinner, pulled variations on the same kinds of pranks, and demonstrated the same fundamental mixture of cleverness and underachievement for the entirety of the show's run. This is the floating timeline in its purest expression. Bart cannot age because if Bart ages, the show ends. He is defined by his age in a way that most child characters are not, his being 10, and in 4th grade and in perpetual conflict with the authority figures of Springfield Elementary is not incidental to who he is. It is the entire architecture of his character. Take 10 away from Bart, and you do not have an older version of Bart. You have a different character entirely. So the show has kept him at 10. This is the central rule, the foundational rule, the rule on which every other Bart-related rule depends. He is 10. He is in 4th grade. He will always be 10. He will always be in 4th grade. And within that overarching rule, the show has broken a remarkable number of smaller rules about what Bart's 10-year-old existence actually means. Let us start with the school records, because they are the most formally established and therefore the most clearly rule-breaking when they fail. Bart's academic record at Springfield Elementary is canon. The show has depicted his grades, his test scores, his teacher evaluations, and Principal Skinner's running documentation of his disciplinary history across dozens of episodes. In some of these episodes, the academic record matters in ways that create genuine dramatic stakes. Bart might fail and be held back. Bart might fail and be sent to a remedial program. Bart might discover that he is actually capable of achieving academically, and the gap between his grades and his potential becomes the episode's emotional center. These episodes establish specific facts about where Bart stands academically at specific moments. And then the next episode begins, and Bart is where he always is. Barely passing, chronically in trouble, not achieving. Now, some of this is explicable. Bart is canonically capable of academic underperformance. The show has established that his situation at school is as much a matter of motivation and circumstance as raw ability. He is not unintelligent. The show has been careful about this, but he has also, across dozens of specific episodes, been shown to have reached specific academic outcomes that should, within the rules of how schools work, have had specific consequences. He should have been held back at least once based on episodes that explicitly set up the possibility and seemed to resolve in ways that did not clearly prevent it. He should have a disciplinary record extensive enough to have triggered consequences that the show establishes exist but then forgets to apply. He should have relationships with specific teachers and administrators that are shaped by the specific incidents the show has depicted, and those relationships should evolve as the incidents accumulate. Instead, the school resets. Each new episode at Springfield Elementary begins with a Bart who has the same relationship with the institution that he has always had. The record exists somewhere in Principal Skinner's files, presumably, but it does not seem to affect how Skinner or the other teachers approach Bart in any cumulative way. This is the memory problem applied to an institution. Springfield Elementary has the same forgetting disease that Springfield itself has, which makes a certain kind of sense. The school exists within the town and presumably follows its rules. But it also means that the school's existence as an institution is somewhat illusory. Schools are memory machines. They exist to record, evaluate, and respond to the accumulated history of individual students over time. A school that does not remember what Bart did last semester is not really functioning as a school. Springfield Elementary is not really functioning as a school. It is functioning as a setting for stories about a 10-year-old who will always be 10. And that is fine, within the logic of what the show is. But it is a rule being broken continuously. The relationship between Bart and Edna Krabappel is the most interesting relationship in Springfield Elementary's history, partly because it is the one relationship in the school that the show has treated with the most nuance and the most willingness to let it evolve. Krabappel is Bart's 4th grade teacher. She is also, across the show's run, one of Springfield's most fully drawn secondary characters, a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine disappointment, whose expectations for her own life have been slowly eroded by the reality of teaching Bart Simpson and the Springfield Elementary student body year after year after year. The rule about the Bart-Krabappel relationship is interesting because it was established carefully and then broken carefully. Early seasons establish the relationship as essentially adversarial. Bart disrupts. Krabappel punishes. Neither respects the other. The dynamic generates comedy. But across later seasons, the show allowed a different note to enter the relationship. A grudging recognition on Krabappel's part of something genuine in Bart. A quieter, more complicated dynamic underneath the surface adversarialism. This evolution is real and was honored with some consistency. The show did not fully reset the Bart-Krabappel relationship the way it reset other ongoing dynamics. There was some genuine continuity in how they related to each other across years. And then Krabappel died. The death of Edna Krabappel was handled with remarkable care by the show. The character was retired following the death of Marcia Wallace, who had voiced her for the show's entire run, and the episode that dealt with her passing was one of the show's more genuinely moving moments in its later seasons. The show kept the emotional truth of the loss while navigating the practical reality of how to address it. What the death created, however, was a specific rule break in Bart's story. If the Bart-Krabappel relationship was one of the most evolved and specifically established ongoing dynamics in the show, and if Krabappel's death removed one of the primary reference points for who Bart is in an institutional context, then the show needed to establish what Bart's relationship to Springfield Elementary looks like after the character who defined that relationship was gone. The show has dealt with this unevenly. Bart's position at school has remained essentially unchanged. He is still the chronic troublemaker in the 4th grade, still navigating the institutional authority of a school that has always been defined partly by Krabappel's presence. But the specific texture of that navigation changed in ways the show has not fully accounted for. The Bart who existed in relation to Krabappel is not quite the same Bart who exists without her. The rules about who Bart is at school, what his relationship to that institution means for him, emotionally and narratively, were built around a dynamic that no longer exists. And the show, while handling the death itself with appropriate care, has been less clear about what replaces the dynamic in the show's ongoing emotional architecture. This is a rule break of a different kind than the ones we have discussed so far. Not a contradiction of an established fact or a forgetting of an established event, but an evolution of the show's circumstances that created a gap in its internal logic, a place where a rule used to be that has not been clearly replaced. Bart's relationship with his own intelligence is another ongoing rule the show has broken in interesting ways. The show has established, across many episodes, that Bart is not unintelligent. He has moments of genuine strategic thinking, real creativity in his pranks and schemes, an ability to read social situations that goes beyond what his academic performance suggests he is capable of. The show has been careful not to make Bart simply stupid. His underperformance at school is presented as a choice, or a disposition, or the result of a system that has never figured out how to reach him, rather than a straightforward reflection of his cognitive ability. This is a character rule, and it is a good one. The Bart who is genuinely funny is not the Bart who is simply dumb. The comedy of Bart works because his schemes are creative even when they fail, because his thinking has a kind of sideways logic to it that the more conventionally intelligent characters around him cannot always follow. But across the show's run, episodes have occasionally pushed Bart's underperformance into territory that implies something more than chosen underachievement. There are moments when Bart seems genuinely unable to understand things that his canonical intelligence level should allow him to understand. There are moments when his response to a situation is so poor that the character rule about his hidden intelligence feels very far away. These moments are usually in service of a joke. The joke requires Bart to be more oblivious than he technically is, and the show lets him be more oblivious because the joke is worth it. But the pattern of those moments, across seasons, creates a secondary portrait of Bart that is in mild contradiction with the primary one. There is the Bart who is smart in the ways that matter to him, who applies genuine intelligence to the things he cares about. And there is the Bart who is played as blankly obtuse whenever the joke requires it. Both Barts appear in the same show. They are not quite the same person. Bart's relationship with his sister Lisa is perhaps the most successfully maintained ongoing relationship in the show, the dynamic that has been honored most consistently across 36 years, and that has, more than any other ongoing relationship, except possibly Homer and Marge, been allowed to evolve in ways that feel genuine. The specific texture of how Bart and Lisa relate to each other, the competition, the rivalry, the moments of genuine solidarity, the particular way they understand each other precisely because they are so different, has been established carefully enough and referenced consistently enough that it functions as a real rule within the show's world. But even here, the rule gets broken in specific ways that are worth noting. The most consistent break is around the question of whether Bart respects Lisa. The show has, across its best moments, established that beneath the surface antagonism, Bart is genuinely proud of Lisa and genuinely values her in ways he would never admit. These moments are among the show's most emotionally effective. When Bart's grudging respect for his sister becomes visible, it is real and it earns its emotional impact. But across other episodes, Bart's attitude toward Lisa resets to something cruder and less nuanced than those moments suggest. He mocks her in ways that do not feel like deflection over genuine respect. He dismisses her in ways that are below the register the show has established for their relationship at its best. The Bart-Lisa dynamic fluctuates between its highest and lowest versions depending on what each individual episode needs, without the highest version moments seeming to permanently elevate where the relationship sits. The show established one of its richest ongoing dynamics in the Bart-Lisa relationship, and it has broken the rules of that dynamic gently but repeatedly, whenever individual episodes needed a simpler or cruder version of the sibling pair to make a joke work. This is the central tension in all of the show's relationship rules. The show's best moments establish something real and specific, and then the show's ongoing need for flexibility means that the real and specific thing cannot always be honored in every episode. The rule exists, the rule gets broken, the relationship survives both. Springfield Elementary itself has its own set of rules that the show has broken in ways that are worth cataloging. The school's budget is one. Across multiple episodes, the school's financial situation has been established as dire in specific ways: programs cut, supplies unavailable, facilities deteriorating. These financial crises are presented as ongoing and serious, with real consequences for the children attending the school. And then in episodes that do not feature the financial crisis as their subject, the school operates as if fully funded, with resources and programs that the financial crisis episodes said were unavailable. The school's physical layout is another. Episodes that take place inside Springfield Elementary have a habit of placing rooms and facilities in locations that are inconsistent with where they have been placed in other episodes. The school's geography shifts based on what each story requires. This is a small break in a small rule, but it contributes to the broader sense of Springfield as a place whose physical reality is malleable. The faculty of the school has changed over the years in ways that are sometimes acknowledged and sometimes simply not. Teachers who were established as present in the school's world disappear without reference. New teachers appear without their newness being noted. The institutional memory of the school, the sense that it is a place that has been running for years with a specific culture and history, is inconsistently maintained. All of this means that Springfield Elementary, as an institution, is somewhat less than the sum of its parts. It is a collection of scenes that take place in a school more than it is a coherent fictional institution with its own consistent internal rules, which, again, is fine for the purposes of what the show is trying to do, but it means that the school's existence as a setting for the rules of Bart's life is itself built on an uncertain foundation. The rules about Bart at school are only as stable as the school itself, and the school, as we have seen, is not particularly stable. Bart's pranks deserve specific attention as a location where the show has broken its own rules with particular consistency. The rule about Bart's pranks is clear enough in the early seasons. The pranks have consequences. Bart pulls a prank. The prank has effects on the people it targets. Those effects generate the episode's plot, and the resolution involves Bart in some way accounting for what his prank did. The accounting is rarely fully satisfying from a disciplinary standpoint. Bart does not typically receive consequences that feel proportionate, but the causality is there. Prank causes effect, causes story, causes resolution. This is a rule about how Bart operates in Springfield's world. His actions have effects. He is not immune to consequence. He is, in fact, the character who faces the most visible consequences of any main character in the early show, because his provocations are so visible and the show follows them through with such specificity. Then the prank-consequence relationship becomes more variable. Episodes in later seasons sometimes set up a prank and then let it dissolve into a different story without really following through on what the prank did. The prank becomes a setup mechanism rather than a narrative engine, a way of getting Bart into a situation rather than a thing that the episode is genuinely about. This is a subtle shift but a meaningful one. The early Bart was a character whose pranks were the truest expression of who he was, specific acts of creative disruption that the show took seriously enough to follow all the way through. The later Bart is sometimes a character who pulls pranks because that is what Bart does, and the prank's role in the story is more functional than expressive. The rule about what Bart's pranks mean, what they say about him, and what they do to the world has softened across the show's run in a way that has affected the character's coherence, quietly and gradually, in the way so many of the show's rule-softening decisions have operated. Bart at 10, Bart in 4th grade, Bart the prankster. Bart the underachiever, Bart the secretly compassionate, Bart the rival of his sister, Bart the son of Homer. All of these Barts are true. None of them are quite consistently the same person. And the show keeps him at 10 because the moment he turns 11, all of the versions of Bart, the contradictions and the consistencies, and the specific 10-year-old architecture of his existence would have to be reorganized into a person who has grown. And the show has never been able to afford that reorganization. He is 10. He will be 10 when the show ends, whenever that is. And in the meantime, the rules of what it means to be 10 in Springfield will continue to be written and rewritten around him, in the same way they have been written and rewritten for 36 years. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not really a power plant. That sounds like the beginning of a conspiracy theory, but stay with it for a moment, because it is actually the most accurate description of what the plant is within the show's internal logic. A real nuclear power plant is a tightly regulated industrial facility operating under federal oversight, subject to regular inspection, staffed by trained personnel, and required to meet specific safety and operational standards that are not optional and cannot be waived by the facility's owner, regardless of how wealthy that owner is. The Springfield nuclear power plant is none of these things. It is something the show describes as a nuclear power plant, and treats visually as a nuclear power plant, but that operates according to a completely different set of rules. Rules that are established clearly within specific episodes and then ignored in other episodes. Rules that contradict federal law and basic physics in ways the show acknowledges and then continues to ignore. Rules that make the plant not a functioning industrial facility, but a background element of Springfield's world that the show picks up and puts down according to what each story needs. The rule-breaking at the plant begins with safety inspections and gets more interesting from there. The show establishes, across multiple episodes, that the Springfield nuclear power plant has accumulated 342 safety violations in a single inspection. This is a canonical, specific number. These violations range from the trivial but alarming to the downright surreal, but the overall picture they create is clear. The plant is operating in a state of near-total regulatory failure. The cost of bringing it up to code has been established, also canonically, as $56 million. Mr. Burns refused to spend it. Now, here is the rule break. A real nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations would not continue operating. It would be shut down by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission while the violations were addressed. The owner's refusal to pay for remediation would not be relevant. The regulator does not ask the owner whether they would like to comply with safety standards. The regulator enforces compliance. The plant either fixes its problems or the plant closes. The Springfield nuclear power plant continues to operate for 36 years with its 342 violations either unaddressed or re-established after brief narrative interventions that the show then forgets. Homer Simpson, whose safety inspector role is established as a genuine regulatory position, continues to fail at that role for 36 years without being replaced, without the plant being shut down, without any of the federal regulatory machinery that governs actual nuclear facilities appearing in any sustained way. This is a world rule break. The rule is that nuclear facilities operate within a regulatory framework that has real enforcement power. Springfield's nuclear plant does not. The show established the regulatory framework, the inspection, the violations, the cost of remediation, and then declined to follow through on what that framework would actually require. Why? Because the plant running, Homer working at the plant, Burns owning the plant, and all of the stories that depend on that configuration continuing are more important to the show's needs than the realistic resolution of 342 safety violations would allow. The rule was established and then broken because the story needed the break. This is the honest version of why the plant's rules do not hold. The plant is a story engine. It generates conflicts and contexts and character dynamics that the show needs. It cannot be shut down or remediated because that would end the engine. So the regulatory reality that should govern it is invoked when it creates useful story elements and ignored when it would inconveniently require the plant to close. Homer's role as a safety inspector is the most specific rule the plant-related storytelling creates, and therefore, the one that gets broken with the most interesting consequences. The rule is this: Homer Simpson is employed as a safety inspector at a nuclear power plant. This is his job. This job exists to prevent nuclear accidents. Homer's job security at this job has been established as essentially unconditional. The deal between Burns and Grandpa Simpson ensures that Homer cannot be permanently fired, but the job itself remains a real job with real responsibilities within the show's world. The rule break is that Homer virtually never performs this job in any recognizable way in episodes that are not specifically about his job. When stories focus on Springfield in general, or on Homer's domestic life, or on any of the hundreds of other things the show has found for Homer to do, his nuclear safety responsibilities evaporate. He is at work, nominally, but the work is not happening. He sleeps at his workstation. He goes on extended adventures that keep him away from the plant for days or weeks. He causes incidents through inattention or active mishandling of materials that should, within the rules about what nuclear safety inspectors do, constitute grounds for immediate termination regardless of any deal with Burns. The rule about what Homer's job means, what obligations it creates, what consequences its failures generate, is suspended whenever those obligations and consequences would constrain the story. And the story regularly requires Homer to be somewhere other than monitoring reactor cores, doing something other than what safety inspectors do. So the job becomes a title more than an activity. Homer Simpson, safety inspector, who does not really do safety inspection at a plant that is not really required to be safe. The physical plant itself is another source of ongoing rule breaking. The facility's interior has been depicted in ways that are inconsistent across episodes. The layout of Homer's work area, the location of the reactor relative to other parts of the facility, the physical setup of the safety monitoring systems that Homer is supposed to be watching. These are small things individually, but a viewer who has seen many episodes set in the plant will accumulate a gradually confused picture of what the facility actually looks like inside. More significantly, the plant's operational status has been depicted inconsistently in ways that go beyond layout. In episodes that specifically deal with plant safety, the facility is described and shown as operating in a state of perpetual low-grade crisis cooling systems, held together with tape and prayers, monitoring equipment that may or may not be functioning, a general atmosphere of managed catastrophe that only the extreme incompetence of everyone involved has prevented from becoming an actual catastrophe. In episodes where the plant is background, where it appears only to establish that Homer is at work, or where it serves as the setting for a storyline, not specifically about nuclear safety, the plant operates as a normal workplace. Homer has coffee. His coworkers chat. The crisis-level dysfunction of the safety-focused episodes is not present. These are two different versions of the same building, operating under two different sets of rules, and the show alternates between them depending on what the story needs. The three-eyed fish is the plant's most famous legacy in the world of Springfield, and it serves as a useful case study in how the plant's rule-breaking operates across time. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is introduced in a Season 2 episode and immediately becomes a significant narrative element, a visible, undeniable piece of evidence that the plant's radioactive runoff is mutating local wildlife. The episode treats this seriously enough to make it the subject of a political campaign. A candidate for governor uses Blinky as the centerpiece of a campaign to expose Burns's negligence and hold him accountable. The rule established by Blinky is clear. The plant's pollution is real, it has visible effects on the local ecosystem, and these effects are significant enough to constitute a public health concern. This is not a subtext or an implication. The show puts it on a campaign poster. Then the rule gets broken in the most elegant way possible. Burns eats Blinky on live television to prove the fish is harmless. The audience watching within the show is satisfied by this. The governor's race moves on. And in every subsequent episode that takes place in or near Springfield's waterways, the question of what the plant's runoff is doing to local wildlife is not a factor. The fish are back to normal fish, or the rivers are not examined, or the story simply does not go anywhere near the ecological reality that Blinky represented. Blinky himself has reappeared in the show multiple times since his Season 2 debut. He has become a Springfield icon, a recurring visual gag, a piece of the town's established iconography, but his reappearances do not revive the rule that his original appearance established. He is no longer evidence of ecological catastrophe. He is a mascot. The rule he represented was downgraded to a joke. This is the plant's most consistent pattern. Specific pieces of evidence for the plant's danger are established, generate a story, and are then gradually downgraded from evidence to atmosphere. The 342 violations become a trivia detail rather than an active regulatory crisis. Blinky becomes a mascot rather than a warning sign. Homer's demonstrated incompetence becomes a character trait rather than an industrial hazard. Each specific rule in isolation gets its episode, and then the rule fades into the background of Springfield, where it continues to exist as a detail rather than a driving force. Burns's relationship to the plant is its own category of rule-breaking, and it deserves specific attention. The rule about Burns and the plant is that Burns is the plant's owner and primary decision-maker, the person whose choices determine how the plant operates and what risks it poses to Springfield. This rule is established clearly and maintained consistently in terms of the basic power structure. Burns owns the plant. Burns's decisions matter. The rule break is in the specifics of what Burns's ownership means for his knowledge and responsibility. In episodes focused on the plant's safety problems, Burns is depicted as aware of those problems and as having made specific decisions to ignore or conceal them. He knows about the violations. He knows about the environmental damage. He has specifically chosen not to address them. This version of Burns is a knowing bad actor, someone who understands what his plant is doing and has decided that the cost of remediation exceeds the value of the people harmed by the damage. In other episodes, Burns is depicted as largely disconnected from the operational realities of the plant. He is a wealthy, eccentric who owns many things, of which the plant is only one. His ignorance of specific operational details, he cannot remember Homer's name, despite Homer working for him for decades, extends into a general disconnection from what the plant actually does and what its problems are. Both versions of Burns appear in the show. The aware, knowing villain who has chosen environmental damage as an acceptable cost of doing business, and the absent, disconnected billionaire who is too busy with the other enormous aspects of his existence to track what his various enterprises are actually doing. These two Burnses operate under different rules about what he knows and what he has chosen. In one, his responsibility is clear and deliberate. In the other, his responsibility is more diffuse and arguably less intentional. The show shifts between them depending on which version serves the story: the deliberate villain in episodes about environmental justice or accountability, the absent billionaire in episodes that need Burns as a comic foil rather than a structural antagonist. The nuclear regulatory world that should govern everything about the plant has its own interesting rule-breaking arc. Early seasons occasionally depict something like a real regulatory apparatus: federal inspectors, official processes, the machinery of nuclear oversight that exists in the real world. These appearances create specific rules about what oversight of the plant looks like and what leverage it has over Burns. And then the regulatory machinery fades. In later seasons, the plant exists in a regulatory context that is barely sketched. The NRC, which in the real world would have ongoing jurisdiction over a facility with the plant's profile, appears rarely. When safety issues come up in later seasons, they are handled in ways that do not invoke the regulatory framework the early show established. The plant operates in something closer to a regulatory vacuum, where Burns's decisions about what to address and what to ignore are not subject to the enforcement mechanisms that the early episodes implied existed. The rule was, there is oversight of this plant, and that oversight has real power. The rule break is, there is oversight when the story needs it to be there, and otherwise the plant operates without meaningful external constraint. This is, if you think about it, a kind of meta-commentary on how environmental regulation actually works in America. The gap between what oversight systems are supposed to do and what they actually do in practice. The Simpsons has always been a sharp, satirical observer of American institutions, and the plant's relationship with its regulatory environment can be read as a deliberate representation of regulatory capture, where the regulator's power is present on paper and absent in practice. But it can also just be the show needing the plant to be a different thing at different moments and finding a way to make that work. Both readings are probably true. The show's rule-breaking is sometimes deliberate satire and sometimes creative convenience, and the best version of The Simpsons is the one where those two motivations are perfectly aligned. The plant's most fundamental rule break is the one that sits underneath all the others. The rule that says Homer working there makes any sense at all. Homer is a man whose IQ the show has placed at 55, which is not a comedic exaggeration but a clinical disability level in standard intelligence scales. He has caused at least one documented nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core. He sleeps at his workstation. He has a crayon in his brain. He is, by every measure the show has established, genuinely and specifically unqualified for the job he has been doing for over 3 decades. The rule that gets broken is the rule of institutional self-preservation. Real institutions, even poorly run ones, will eventually remove employees who are actively dangerous to the institution's survival. A nuclear facility whose safety inspector causes incidents by throwing food into reactor cores would not continue employing that safety inspector, regardless of what deal the owner made with the inspector's grandfather. The show established the deal Burns' guarantee to Grandpa that Homer's job would be protected as the explanation for why Homer cannot be permanently fired. This is a rule. Homer has job security because of a specific agreement that predates his employment and that Burns is honoring as part of a deal made in his own interest. The rule break is that this explanation was introduced relatively late in the show's run, and the Homer who worked at the plant for the preceding seasons was working there under a different and less specified logic. Early Homer's job security was more about the show needing Homer at the plant than about any in-world explanation for why Homer would be kept on. The Grandpa deal explained something retroactively that had existed as a simple narrative given, and even with the deal as explanation, the specific ways in which Homer fails at his job across the show's run go beyond anything that an employer, even a corrupt, negligent employer honoring a prior deal, would tolerate. The deal protects Homer from being fired. It does not explain why Burns would allow Homer to continue operating in ways that periodically threaten the plant's operational status, unless Burns wants the violations to continue, which is its own theory about what the plant actually is, and one the show has gestured toward without fully committing to. The plant's rules are interesting because they reveal the show's willingness to simultaneously use an institution's realistic details, federal violations, regulatory mechanisms, safety standards, and suspend those details' realistic consequences whenever the story requires. It is not hypocrisy or laziness. It is the show doing what it has always done, taking the real world seriously enough to depict it accurately and then suspending accuracy when accuracy would constrain the story. Springfield's nuclear plant is what happens when you need a symbol of corporate negligence, of working-class vulnerability, of the specific American anxiety about industrial power and its costs, and also need a setting for hundreds of stories that require that symbol to remain operational and unchanged across decades. The plant is a rule and a rule break simultaneously. It is the show at its most honest about its own nature. Section 7. Mr. Burns and the Laws of Time, Money, and Death. Charles Montgomery Burns should be dead. He has been shot, collapsed, diagnosed with every known disease simultaneously, hospitalized on dozens of occasions, abandoned in the wilderness, starved, attacked by animals, and placed in medical situations that the show has at various points described as terminal. He is over 100 years old, possibly significantly older, in a show where the most conservative reading of his biographical details places his birth in the 1880s, and the most liberal reading pushes it back further still. He is alive. He is not just alive. He is operational. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a strategic intelligence that most of his much younger business rivals cannot match. He manipulates local and sometimes national politics. He pursues elaborate schemes that require sustained attention, long-term planning, and a working understanding of modern financial and legal systems that a man born in the 19th century would have had to update and maintain across a century of dramatic change. Mr. Burns is, within the show's world, a genuine impossibility. And the rules his impossibility breaks are not just the biological rules about human lifespans. They are the rules about consistency, about what the show tells us about him, and whether those things hold together across 36 years of episodes. Let us start with the age problem, because it is the most documented and the most clearly rule-breaking of Burns's various impossibilities. The show has established Burns's age in multiple ways across its run, and these establishings do not all agree with each other. In one episode, a specific birth year is given that places Burns in his late 80s or 90s by the time of the show's early seasons. In other episodes, biographical details are introduced: events Burns experienced personally, historical figures he knew, things he did in specific decades that push his age considerably past what the first number suggested. Burns has referenced personal memories from the Spanish-American War. He has described interactions with figures who died before World War I. He has told stories about the Gilded Age as lived experience rather than history. He served in World War II, which is at the far edge of the possible given even the most conservative reading of his age. These are factual rule breaks. The rule says Burns was born in a specific year and is therefore a specific age. The biographical details the show introduces across different episodes require him to have been born in different decades to have done the things the show says he did. Not all of these can be simultaneously true. The show's writers have been aware of this inconsistency and have, at various points, leaned into it as part of Burns's character, treating his age as deliberately impossible as one of the things about Burns that does not follow normal rules. This is a reasonable creative choice. Burns is not a normal character. Making his age a kind of walking impossibility is consistent with the overall presentation of him as someone who exists outside the rules that govern everyone else. But the inconsistencies within the age story, not between Burns is old and Burns follows normal aging rules, but between the different specific ages the show implies across different episodes, are still rule breaks. They are the show being inconsistent with itself at the level of specific detail, which is the most basic kind of rule breaking there is. The treatment Burns gets keeps him alive, and it is one of the show's most interesting ongoing elements. The Springfield Files episode, where Burns's weekly medical regimen is depicted in enough detail to become plot relevant, established a specific rule about how Burns's survival works. He receives a treatment every 7 days that is intensive enough to cause his body to visibly glow. Without the treatment, he dies. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week, at which point another treatment is required. This is a rule about an ongoing process. The rule implies that Burns's survival is precarious, managed, and entirely dependent on a specific set of resources and people. It implies that if Smithers ever fails to schedule the treatment, or if Burns is somehow separated from the facility where the treatment happens, or if the treatment itself is ever disrupted, Burns dies. But across the show's subsequent episodes, this rule is honored selectively and ignored when inconvenient. Burns is separated from Springfield for extended periods in various episodes without any reference to the treatment schedule that should make such separation potentially fatal. Burns is depicted in situations where the weekly treatment would have been missed based on the episode's timeline, without the show noting or accounting for this. The treatment rule exists as a piece of world building that generates a specific story in its originating episode and then fades into the background, available to be invoked when useful and ignored when it would constrain the story. This is exactly the same pattern we have seen with other rules. The rule is established with specificity, honored in its episode, and then softened into something less binding in the episodes that follow. Burns's Three Stooges syndrome, the simultaneous presence of every known disease, existing in equilibrium because they all cancel each other out, is another rule in this pattern. Within its originating scene, it creates a specific, memorable, almost perfectly constructed comedic and conceptual moment. The sickest man in America, kept alive by the sheer volume of things trying to kill him. The rule is vivid and specific and brilliantly observed, and then it recedes. Not because it is contradicted, the show does not come back and tell you Burns is healthy, but because subsequent depictions of Burns do not honor the full implication of what having every known disease in perfect equilibrium would mean for how a body actually functions. Burns is frail, yes. Burns is physically weak, yes. But the Three Stooges version of Burns, in which his body is a site of ongoing catastrophic multi-disease competition, does not quite match the Burns who is able to scheme and manipulate and pursue his various projects with sustained cognitive energy. The diseased Burns and the operationally functional Burns are both true within the show's world. They are not quite compatible with each other. The show keeps both of them because both of them are useful. Burns's wealth is another area where the rules have been applied inconsistently across the show's run. The rule about Burns's wealth is simple and foundational. Burns is rich. Extremely rich. His wealth is described as billion-folds plural in some episodes, as more specific figures in others, and the exact number varies across the show's history in ways that are not always consistent. But the basic rule, Burns has essentially unlimited financial resources relative to anything Springfield or its residents could muster, is maintained consistently enough to function as a reliable character foundation. Where the rule breaks occur is in the application of that wealth to specific situations. Burns's unlimited resources are subject to limits whenever the story requires those limits. He is stopped or frustrated by financial constraints in episodes where his being stopped or frustrated is the point. He is unable to buy his way out of specific situations that his wealth should theoretically allow him to resolve. The specific power of his money fluctuates based on what the episode needs, rather than on any consistent rule about what money at that level actually buys. The most interesting version of this is Burns's relationship with municipal and political power. Within Springfield's world, Burns's influence over local politics, local business, and local institutions is established as enormous. He essentially owns the town not in a metaphorical sense but in a fairly literal one. The nuclear plant provides the electricity, the plant provides the employment. The town's economic survival is tied to the plant's continued operation. And the plant is Burns's. In episodes that specifically examine this power structure, the rules it implies are honored. Springfield cannot challenge Burns because Springfield cannot afford to. The population's welfare depends on the continued goodwill of a man who has no particular goodwill toward them. This is a coherent and specifically observed power dynamic. But in other episodes, Springfield challenges Burns routinely, and without the existential stakes that the power structure episodes establish. Characters confront Burns. Legal processes are invoked against him. He is occasionally defeated by mechanisms that, given what the show says about his wealth and influence, should not be able to reach him. These are not simply stories where the underdog wins despite the odds. Some of them are. But some of them involve defeating Burns in ways that require ignoring the rules about what his wealth and power actually make possible. The show's political satire and its comedy both need Burns to be defeatable in specific contexts, and so the defeatable Burns appears in those contexts, even when the structural Burns, the one whose power is so embedded in Springfield's survival that challenging him is genuinely dangerous, would not be. Burns's emotional life is its own category of rule-breaking, and perhaps the most interesting one. The early show established Burns as essentially emotionally dead, a man so thoroughly defined by wealth, power, and the particular cruelty of having lived too long through too much that genuine human connection was effectively beyond him. This version of Burns is a cartoon villain with just enough specificity to be interesting. The billionaire who cannot remember his employee's name, who has contempt for the people whose labor funds his existence, who experiences other people primarily as obstacles or instruments. But across the show's later seasons, Burns has been given moments of genuine emotional complexity that do not quite fit the emotionally dead version. He has fallen in love, or something close to it. He has experienced genuine loss in ways the show has played with real feeling. He has demonstrated, in scattered moments across many years, something that resembles human connection even if it immediately retreats behind the established mask of contempt and calculation. These moments are individually effective. Burns as a character is more interesting with them than without them, but they create a rule break at the character level. The emotional capacity these moments reveal is not consistent with the emotional void that other episodes establish. There are two Burnses, the one who is genuinely beyond human feeling, and the one who contains feeling that he has never been able to let survive contact with his circumstances, and the show has never reconciled them. The reconciliation would probably require a story the show is not positioned to tell. A story about what it costs a person to live for a century the way Burns has lived, accumulating the specific damage that comes from that kind of longevity in the context of that kind of power. The emotional version of Burns that occasionally breaks through is the buried cost of the monstrous version. But the show cannot tell that story in a sustained way without transforming what Burns is, and Burns as he is, monstrous and calculating and darkly comic, is too valuable to the show as a structural element to risk transforming. So both Burnses continue. The monster and the buried human. The consistency and the break. The rule and the exception that the rule cannot quite contain. Smithers's relationship to Burns is the most continuously maintained ongoing dynamic in the show, and it is the one where the rules have been most carefully and interestingly evolved across the show's run. The rule about Smithers is established early and clearly. He is devoted to Burns in a way that exceeds professional loyalty and that the show treats with varying degrees of explicitness as something more personal. This devotion is the most consistent thing about Smithers across all of the show's seasons. Other aspects of his character have shifted his competence level, his role in various episodes, the specific texture of his interaction with other characters, but the devotion is always there. But the rules about what that devotion means, what it costs Smithers, what it has done to him, what he has given up in its service, have shifted across the show's run in ways that are worth examining. Early Smithers is defined almost entirely by the devotion. His identity outside of Burns is barely sketched. He exists to serve Burns, and to represent in that service something about what total loyalty does to a person. He is a character defined by his function in relation to another character. Later, Smithers is given an inner life that complicates this. He has interests, he has friendships that exist independent of Burns, he has desires that the show eventually begins addressing with more directness and care. He becomes, gradually, a fuller character, someone who has a life outside of the devotion even if the devotion remains central. This is a positive evolution, and it is one of the better rule adjustments the show has made, taking a character who was initially defined by a single function and slowly building out the person behind the function. But it creates a rule break in the continuity of who Smithers is. The Smithers of the later seasons, with his fuller inner life and his clearer sense of his own desires, does not quite match the Smithers of the early seasons, who appeared to have no inner life outside of Burns. The show does not acknowledge this as a change. Smithers has simply always been the person the later seasons show him to be, retroactively. The way the show retroactively extends characterization backward into a past it did not actually depict. This is a kind of rule break that goes in a positive direction. The show creates a richer character by breaking the rule of who the character used to be. The break is worth the richness, arguably, but it is still a break. Burns's relationship to history, to the specific events of American history that he has personally witnessed and participated in, is another ongoing source of rule-breaking, and it is one that the show has used for some of its most memorable comedic material. The rule is that Burns's age means he was present for things. The show uses this across many episodes, a reference to a historical figure or event, delivered in Burns's voice with the casual familiarity of personal experience. These moments are consistently funny and consistently characteristic. Burns's relationship to history as lived experience rather than textbook knowledge is one of the things that makes him unique among Springfield's characters. The rule break is that the specific historical events the show places Burns at are not always consistent with each other. His role in World War II, specifically, has been depicted in ways that shift across different episodes. The specific things he did, the specific units he served with, the specific crimes and services and adventures of that period of his life are different in different episodes that address them. The show has returned to Burns's wartime experience often enough that the inconsistencies have accumulated into a version of his history that cannot fully cohere. This is partly the floating timeline problem applied to a very old character. The further back a character's history extends, the more opportunities there are for different episodes to fill in that history in ways that do not quite align. Burns's history extends back far enough that there is enormous territory for inconsistency, and the show has been writing and rewriting that territory since the early seasons. What the inconsistency creates beyond a technical continuity problem is a Burns whose past is as unstable as his present. He is a man who cannot quite be pinned down to a specific history. Who was present at historical events in ways that vary depending on when you ask? Who has been telling stories about his past for so long that the stories themselves have started to contradict each other? There is something almost appropriate about this for a man who has lived as long as Burns has. Human memory at extreme age does not store the past as a stable archive. It is reconstructive, variable, subject to the same drift and revision that the show applies to its own history. Burns's inconsistent past is, accidentally or deliberately, one of the most psychologically realistic things about him. Or it is just the show breaking a factual rule because different writers needed different biographical details and did not check what had been established before. Both are probably true. Both are interesting. Lisa Simpson is the smartest person in Springfield. This is a rule the show has established clearly and maintained with relative consistency across its run. Lisa's intelligence, her curiosity, her moral seriousness, her ability to see things that the people around her cannot or will not see is the core of who she is, in a way that is more foundational than most of the show's other character definitions. Take Homer's appetite away, and he is still recognizably Homer. Take Bart's rebelliousness away, and something else is always there. Take Lisa's intelligence away, and there is no Lisa. So, the rule is important, and the way the show breaks it is correspondingly interesting. The first and most persistent rule break around Lisa's intelligence is not about whether she is smart. She is always smart. The break is about what her being smart means in Springfield's world, what it does for her, what it costs her, what it makes possible, and how the people around her respond to it. The rule that gets established in the show's early seasons is that Lisa's intelligence isolates her. She is smarter than her family, smarter than her classmates, smarter than most of the adults in Springfield, and this gap creates a specific kind of loneliness. She cannot be fully understood by the people closest to her. Her perspective on events is consistently more accurate than anyone else's, and that accuracy is consistently ignored or dismissed by a town that rewards loudness and social conformity over genuine insight. This rule, Lisa's intelligence as a source of isolation, is one of the most carefully maintained, ongoing elements of her character. The show has returned to it in almost every season, in episodes that take seriously the specific and ongoing cost of being the most perceptive person in a room full of people who are not interested in being perceived. The rule break is in how other characters respond to Lisa's intelligence in specific moments. In episodes that establish the isolation rule, the people around Lisa, her family, her classmates, Springfield at large, are consistently unable to value what she offers. Her insights are dismissed. Her warnings go unheeded. Her intelligence is treated as an inconvenience at best and an active irritant at worst. But in other episodes, usually when the story needs Lisa's intelligence to be recognized in order to drive the plot, the characters around her respond to her very differently. Homer, who in the isolation episodes appears constitutionally unable to recognize what Lisa is telling him about the world, demonstrates genuine appreciation for his daughter's intelligence in moments that require him to. Bart, who in sibling rivalry episodes treats Lisa's intelligence as a target for mockery, demonstrates real respect for it in episodes that need the sibling relationship to go to a warmer place. These are not necessarily contradictions in character, told or inconsistent. Brothers mock sisters and also love them. Fathers fail to see their children and also see them clearly. The inconsistency in how other characters respond to Lisa can be read as realistic human variability rather than rule-breaking. But the pattern is significant. The characters around Lisa respond to her intelligence as the episode requires them to respond. When the story needs Lisa to be isolated, they are incapable of appreciating her. When the story needs Lisa to be seen, they see her. The underlying consistency of their response, the idea that these specific people have a stable, established relationship to Lisa's intelligence, is less present than the episode-level flexibility that makes the story work. Lisa's moral commitments are another source of ongoing rule-breaking, and perhaps a more significant one. The rule about Lisa's ethics is that she has them, they are serious, and she acts on them. This is not simply a character trait in the way that Homer's love of donuts is a character trait. Lisa's ethical commitments are presented as foundational to her identity. They are what she is made of, not what she happens to enjoy. She became a vegetarian in season 7, and this was one of the show's earliest and most prominent commitments to a character change that stuck. The show has maintained Lisa's vegetarianism across all subsequent seasons, which is remarkable given how thoroughly it has otherwise avoided lasting character evolution. But the rules about what other ethical commitments Lisa holds have been considerably less stable. Lisa has been an environmentalist in episodes where environmentalism serves the story, and a character whose environmentalism is not visible in episodes where it would complicate the story's requirements. She has expressed views about animal rights, political structures, educational justice, economic inequality, and dozens of other issues that the show has depicted in specific episodes as important to her, and then treated as background in subsequent episodes where those views would be inconvenient. This is partly because Lisa's range of moral concerns is so broad that the show cannot honor all of them in every episode without making every episode about Lisa's conscience. That would be unsustainable. So the show necessarily selects which of Lisa's commitments to foreground based on what the episode needs. But the selection is not random, and it creates a pattern. Lisa's commitments are most visible and most integral to the story in episodes specifically about those commitments. In other episodes, those same commitments are present only as background color or absent entirely. The Lisa who is willing to go to considerable lengths to advocate for a cause in one episode is not reliably present in the next episode to advocate for the same cause or a connected one. This creates two parallel Lisas who coexist across the show's run. The Lisa of the dedicated episodes fully committed, willing to act, morally serious in ways that affect the story, and the Lisa of the episodes where she is a supporting character in someone else's story. In the second category, Lisa's commitments are present as a character note, but not as a narrative force. The rule being broken is the rule about what being a person of genuine moral conviction means. In a character for whom ethical commitment is foundational, That commitment should be present and active, even when it is not the episode's subject. The Lisas who appears in other people's stories should be visibly shaped by the same convictions as the Lisa in her own stories. She is not always... The show needs a Lisa who can participate in various Springfield adventures without her ethics consistently stopping the story cold, and so a slightly softer version of Lisa's commitments appears in those episodes, where her vegetarianism is noted and her general seriousness is visible, but her specific views are not in active dialogue with events. Lisa's saxophone is an interesting rule in itself. The show has established this instrument as fundamental to her character. It is the external symbol of her inner life, the thing she has when the rest of Springfield gives her nothing, the sound of her particular consciousness moving through the world. Episodes that use the saxophone well use it as exactly this, a way of seeing into Lisa that dialogue alone would not achieve. The rule break is that the saxophone appears when the story needs it and is absent when it would slow things down. Lisa does not carry the saxophone everywhere, which is realistic, but the instrument also appears and disappears from her life in episode-to-episode terms in ways that are not always consistent with the specific role it has been established as playing. In some episodes, the saxophone is so integral to Lisa that losing it or being denied the ability to play it constitutes a genuine crisis. In other episodes, it is simply not present, and Lisa functions without it in ways that suggest it is not actually as central as the saxophone-focused episodes imply. This is a small rule break but a characteristic one. The show establishes something as essential to a character and then treats it as optional when the episode does not need it. Lisa's relationship with religion is one of the show's most carefully handled ongoing developments, and it illustrates both the best and worst of how the show manages long-form character rules. In Season 13, Lisa converted to Buddhism. This was presented as a genuine and considered character choice, not a one-episode flirtation with a different worldview, but a real shift in how Lisa relates to questions of meaning and ethics. The episode was thoughtful about what Buddhism actually is and what it would mean for this specific character, and the show committed to the conversion in a way that was intended to be permanent. Buddhism has remained part of Lisa's character since the conversion. This is notable. It is one of the few character changes the show has allowed to fully stick in the same category as the vegetarianism. The show deserves credit for maintaining this, but the rules about what Lisa's Buddhism means for her specific behaviors and choices have been applied inconsistently. In episodes that focus on her faith, the Buddhist framework is present and active. She thinks through problems using it. She makes choices that reflect it. Her particular ethical perspective is colored by it in visible ways. In other episodes, the Buddhism is a background detail rather than an active influence on her approach to events. This is arguably realistic. Few people apply the entirety of their philosophical or religious framework to every moment of every day. But for a character whose commitments are supposed to be foundational rather than occasional, the inconsistency matters. The Lisa who took Buddhism seriously enough to convert is not always the same Lisa who appears in episodes where the Buddhism is merely noted. The rule about what Lisa's intelligence eventually produces, what it leads to, what it builds toward, is the deepest rule the show has broken around this character. And this break is not a mistake. It is the show's most honest admission about what it is. Future episodes have shown us Lisa grown up. The Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding depicts her as a young adult in what was then the near future. Later episodes have returned to possible futures for Lisa and shown different versions of who she becomes. These episodes are among the show's most emotionally effective, because they allow the show to do what it cannot do in the present tense. Imagine what the passage of time actually means for these characters. And in those future glimpses, Lisa has become genuinely extraordinary. A president, a Nobel laureate, a person who did, eventually, manage to bring her intelligence and her ethics into effective contact with a world large enough to need them. The rule break is that this future Lisa cannot connect to the present Lisa through any continuous, logical process of development, because the present Lisa is always 8 and will always be 8. The future Lisas exist in isolated glimpses that the show cannot follow through. They are the what if rather than the what will be. And the distance between 8-year-old Lisa and those grown-up futures is one the show can point to but never close. Lisa's intelligence in the end is the show's most explicit statement about what its rule-breaking costs in human terms. Here is a person with the potential to do genuinely important things. Here is a specific child who, given time and opportunity, could become a specific adult whose life and work would matter. And the show's fundamental structure, the floating timeline, the permanent present. The rule that nobody ages prevents that child from ever becoming that adult within the story's ongoing life. The break is in the promise. The show promises, in those future glimpses, that Lisa's intelligence leads somewhere. And then the floating timeline breaks that promise every week by keeping her at 8, in 3rd grade, in Springfield, where the world is not yet ready for what she has to offer. This is the rule about what intelligence means in a world that does not change. And it is the most human thing The Simpsons has ever said. The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other scripted television show in history. This is not a claim made loosely. By any reasonable count, the show has featured hundreds of real-world celebrities playing versions of themselves or original characters across its run, at a pace and volume that has no parallel in the history of the medium. This is, in one way, a structural achievement. The show's longevity and cultural centrality have made appearing on The Simpsons something that notable people actively want to do. From the earliest seasons, a guest appearance on the show carried a specific kind of cultural cachet, a signal that you were famous enough, interesting enough, and willing enough to engage with satire to participate in Springfield's world. But the guest star tradition has also created its own set of rule-breaking problems, and these are some of the show's most interesting and least discussed ones. The first and most basic rule break is the one about what Springfield is. Early Springfield was a town that existed at a remove from the larger world, not isolated, not disconnected from cultural reality, but specific. The particular texture of Springfield's existence was partly defined by its smallness, its insulation from the kind of largeness that celebrity represents. Springfield was the kind of place where the most notable visitors were regional figures, minor celebrities, people whose fame was real but whose reach was limited. And then the celebrities began arriving. And arriving. Season after season, decade after decade, a parade of the actually, genuinely, globally famous appeared in Springfield as if it were a normal place for them to be, drawn by circumstances that the episodes constructed with varying degrees of plausibility. Tom Jones performed there. Paul McCartney was encountered in Springfield's countryside. Dozens of musicians, actors, athletes, politicians, and public figures found their way to a mid-sized American city that had been established as not the kind of place these people normally appeared. The rule being broken is the rule about what Springfield is in the context of the larger world. Early Springfield's rules implied a certain scale, a certain relationship between the town and the wider world that placed the town in a recognizable position. Notable but not famous. Known but not internationally significant. The kind of place that the actually famous passed through rather than sought out. The celebrity tradition gradually dissolved this rule. Springfield, over decades of high-profile guest appearances, stopped being the kind of place that famous people passed through and became the kind of place that the most famous people in the world actively sought out. Tom Jones does not play venues that the early Springfield implied Springfield to be. But Tom Jones played Springfield, and the show wanted him there, and the rule about what Springfield is had to bend to accommodate it. This is a world rule break, of a specific and interesting kind. The show did not change Springfield's physical appearance or its institutional character. It changed Springfield's cultural gravity, its ability to attract and hold people who the established version of the town should not have been able to attract. The guest star problem has a second dimension that is separate from the world rule break and perhaps more interesting. The question of what celebrities do to the show's reality when they appear as themselves. Most of the show's guest celebrities play themselves slightly caricatured, sometimes willing to be self-deprecating or mocked, but recognizably themselves. This creates an interesting rule break because it makes Springfield's world continuous with the real world in a way that has unusual implications. If Michael Jackson appears in Springfield as Michael Jackson, then the world of The Simpsons contains the real Michael Jackson. It is a world where Michael Jackson exists and is the Michael Jackson we know from our world. This seems unproblematic until you start following the logic. If the real Michael Jackson exists in Springfield's world, then all of the specific facts of his real existence exist there too. His music, his history, the specific arc of his life. The Springfield that contains Michael Jackson is a Springfield that exists in the same historical stream as our world. But Springfield also contains things that our world does not contain. It contains a nuclear power plant with 342 violations that has never been shut down. It contains a man who has been alive for over a century through medical treatments that do not exist in our world. It contains children who do not age and a town whose geography is internally inconsistent. These things cannot coexist in a world that is continuous with our own without creating enormous logical problems. The guest star tradition essentially asserts that Springfield's world is both the same as ours and different from it simultaneously. The celebrity guests are real-world people existing in a fictional world that operates by different rules than the world they actually live in. This is a rule break that the show has never tried to resolve and never needed to, because the comedy of the guest appearances generally does not require the logical implications to be followed. The fun of the Michael Jackson episode is not dependent on working out whether Billie Jean exists in Springfield's musical history. The fun is in the situation and the specific comedy of that particular encounter between that particular celebrity and the Simpsons. But it leaves Springfield in a permanent state of logical indeterminacy about its relationship to reality. Is Springfield our world? Is it an adjacent world? Is it a separate fiction that happens to contain real people? The guest star tradition makes this question impossible to answer consistently. The third rule break in the guest star tradition is the most specific and the most interesting. What happens to the episodes after the celebrities in them are no longer who they were? The show's earliest celebrity guest appearances are now, in some cases, over 30 years old. The celebrities who appeared then have, in many cases, continued to live public lives that have taken them in directions that complicate what the episode showed. Some have died. Some have been involved in controversies that dramatically altered their public image. Some have simply evolved as public figures in ways that make the episode's specific treatment of them feel dated or strange. The rules about what those episodes are have changed as the real world has changed around them. An episode built around a celebrity's specific public image becomes, over time, a document of that image at a particular moment, sometimes a moment that feels distant from who that person is or was now understood to be. This is not exactly the show breaking its own rules. It is reality breaking the show's rules, which is a different and less controllable thing. But it creates a rule break in the sense that the episode was built on an assumption that the celebrity's public image would remain stable enough to be the basis for the episode's humor that has not always proved sound. The guest star tradition's effect on the show's internal logic is most visible in the later seasons, where the volume of celebrity appearances increased to a point where the rule about Springfield's relative obscurity had been so thoroughly abandoned that the show stopped even pretending it applied. Later, Springfield is a town that major global celebrities visit as a matter of routine, for reasons that the episodes construct with varying degrees of care. The world rule about Springfield's cultural scale is simply not present anymore. This is a gradual erosion of a rule through repetition. Each individual celebrity appearance was a small break in the rule. The accumulation of hundreds of them across decades is the rule's complete elimination. Guest characters who appear as original creations rather than celebrity cameos have their own rule-breaking history, separate from the world rule issues that real celebrities create. The show has introduced hundreds of original recurring characters across its run. Many of these characters have specific, established personalities, histories, and relationships to Springfield's regular cast. And across the show's long run, many of these characters have been treated inconsistently, appearing in ways that do not match their established characterization, or having their histories subtly altered to fit a specific episode's needs, or disappearing from the show's regular rotation and then reappearing without acknowledgement of the time that has passed. Sideshow Bob is perhaps the most interesting case study among the show's recurring original characters, because he has his own fully developed rule set and his own history of rule-breaking. The rule about Sideshow Bob is elegant in its simplicity. He is a brilliant man who harbors a specific, long-standing desire to kill Bart Simpson. This desire has survived prison, exile, marriage, and the exposure of every scheme he has attempted. It is the most consistent motivating force for any character in the show's history, more consistent, in some ways, than Homer's hunger or Bart's desire to cause trouble. But the rules about Sideshow Bob beyond that core motivation have been applied inconsistently across his many appearances. His relationship to violence, how willing he actually is to kill, how competent he is at pursuing the goal. His whole existence is organized around fluctuates in ways that serve each episode's comic or dramatic needs. In some appearances, he is genuinely threatening. In others, he is essentially comedic, fumbling toward his goal in ways that suggest his actual dangerousness is considerably less than the threat he represents. His intelligence, which the show has established as remarkable, is similarly variable. The Bob, who could have been a great man who chose this strange and specifically focused path because something in his history made Bart Simpson the organizing principle of his existence, is present in some episodes and absent. In others, where a simpler, more purely functional villain is what the story needs. Bob's family history, introduced in later episodes, creates its own rule breaks. His wife, his son, his brother, these characters were added to his story in ways that are individually interesting, but that complicate the established rule about who Bob is and what drives him. A man with a wife and a son who both love him is a different kind of person than the brilliant, isolated, obsessive the early Bob episodes established. The show added these characters without fully resolving how they changed the rule of who Bob is. Most recently, the show did finally give Bob what he wanted. He killed Bart. In a Treehouse of Horror episode, which the show designates as non-canonical, Bob killed Bart, sat with the reality of the achieved goal for a moment, and then discovered that having achieved it left him without a purpose. It is a beautifully observed character moment, and it is also a moment that could only happen in the non-canonical space, because making it canonical would require the show to follow through on what the rule about Bob actually requires. If Bob gets what he wants, he is no longer the Bob the show needs. The non-canonical space, the Treehouse of Horror episodes, the flash-forward episodes, the deliberately dream sequence episodes is where the show puts all the rule-breaking it cannot do in canonical Springfield. It is the show's release valve, the place where the rules can be suspended completely without consequence, because the episode announces in advance that what happens here does not count. The existence of this space is itself a rule break of a meta kind. The rule is that the show's episodes are the show's episodes, they depict what happens in the show's world. The Treehouse of Horror tradition creates a subcategory of episode that does not depict what happens in the show's world, that is explicitly exempt from canon, but that is still part of the show. The line between what counts and what does not count is established by genre convention rather than any in-world logic. And the line is not always clean. Some things introduced in Treehouse of Horror episodes have been referenced in canonical episodes. Some things established in canonical episodes have been used as premises for Treehouse of Horror stories in ways that blur the boundary. The rule about what is canonical is itself somewhat porous, and the show has occasionally moved things across that boundary in ways that create their own consistency problems. The guest star tradition, the recurring original characters, and the canonical, non-canonical distinction are all sites where the show's rules about what Springfield is and what happens there have been bent, broken, dissolved, and rebuilt across 36 years of storytelling. What they have in common is that they all serve the show's primary need, to remain interesting across an impossibly long run. Bringing in new celebrities keeps the show culturally relevant. Adding new recurring characters expands the world and creates new story possibilities. The Treehouse of Horror tradition allows the show to explore ideas that the canonical Springfield cannot accommodate. The rules break in service of the show's survival. And the show's survival is why the rules exist to break in the first place. Let us go further into Homer's physical impossibility, because there is considerably more to examine than what we have already covered. The specific injuries Homer has survived across the show's run deserve their own careful inventory, because the pattern within them tells you something about the show's evolving relationship with its own rules. In the early seasons, Homer's physical resilience is present but contextual. He survives things that are survivable for a tough person in extremely lucky circumstances. He is not supernatural. He is just extremely durable in the way that cartoon characters need to be able to take physical punishment that would sideline a normal person while still being recognizably limited by physical reality in ways that create dramatic stakes. The progression toward actual invulnerability is gradual and worth tracing across seasons. By season 5, Homer's body has begun absorbing punishment that goes beyond what the early season Homer could plausibly absorb. Falls that would shatter bones. Impacts at speeds that should be fatal. The show begins using Homer's body more like a cartoon object than a human one, and the comedy starts reflecting this shift. The jokes about Homer's physical suffering become more about the extremity of the suffering itself and less about the recognizably human quality of it. By season 8 or 9, Homer's body is essentially operating by cartoon physics. He falls downstairs repeatedly without injury in ways that are clearly played as pure slapstick rather than as the survivable but painful events the early show depicted. The distinction matters because it represents a rule break. The rule about Homer's relationship to physical reality has shifted from extremely durable human to cartoon character who occupies a human form. This shift happens in parallel with a broader stylistic shift in the show's sensibility during what many fans consider its first great creative evolution. The show's comedy became broader, more overtly cartoonish, more willing to abandon the grounded reality of its earliest seasons in favor of bigger, stranger stories. Homer's body became a tool for that broader comedy rather than a realistic constraint on it. The specific episodes where Homer's physical invulnerability is most explicitly on display are worth examining because they reveal the rule break in its starkest terms. Homer's triple bypass from Season 4, one of the show's most emotionally resonant episodes, establishes very clearly that Homer's heart is in serious, medically documented condition. The episode takes his cardiac situation seriously. The surgery is real. The emotional stakes around whether Homer will survive are real. The rule being established: Homer's body is subject to the normal consequences of decades of terrible diet and high stress, and those consequences are catching up with him. Then, the show runs several seasons without meaningfully honoring this rule. Homer's cardiac history appears as a reference point in episodes specifically about his health, and then disappears from the texture of his ongoing existence. He eats. He exerts himself. He survives impacts that would be devastating for anyone, let alone a man with his established cardiac history. The rule established in Homer's triple bypass that Homer's heart is a specific, documented vulnerability cannot be simultaneously true with the rule established by his subsequent physical adventures that Homer's body absorbs punishment without reference to his known vulnerabilities. But the show needs both rules. It needs the cardiac history because it is emotionally significant and generates specific kinds of stories. It needs the physical invulnerability because it generates the other kinds of stories. So, both rules exist, and the contradiction between them is simply not addressed. Homer's relationship with sleep is another under-examined rule break in his physical existence. The show has established that Homer sleeps a great deal. He falls asleep at his workstation, at home, in public, and in a range of situations that would be alarming if they were not played as so characteristic. The frequency and ease of his sleeping has been established as a known trait, but the rule about what Homer's sleeping means for his alertness and cognitive function during his waking hours has been applied inconsistently. In episodes where Homer's inattention or sleepiness drives the story, his inability to stay awake has genuine consequences. In other episodes, Homer is fully alert and engaged in ways that do not match the established pattern of constant sleepiness. Sleep is cognitively regulated in ways that the show's treatment of Homer does not consistently honor. A person who sleeps as often and as easily as Homer is presented as sleeping would show specific cognitive effects during waking hours, the kind of microsleep events and attention lapses that chronic oversleepers demonstrate. Homer shows these effects when they are useful for comedy, and not when they would complicate the story. Homer's emotional memory is another dimension of his physical existence, located at the boundary between the psychological and the neurological, where the rules have been consistently broken in interesting ways. The show has established that Homer has genuine emotional depth. He loves his family in a way that is occasionally able to break through the fog of his daily incompetence in moments of genuine clarity. These moments are among the show's most affecting: the Homer who is genuinely present with Marge in the right circumstances, the Homer who sees Bart clearly when the fog lifts, the Homer whose relationship with his children contains more real love than the surface comedy suggests. The rule being established is that beneath Homer's cognitive limitations, there is a real emotional life, that the love is genuine even when the expression of it fails. This rule is maintained with some consistency across the show's run. Homer's emotional moments are among its most effective, and they feel real in part because the show has maintained the basic truth of his love for his family across all 36 years. But the rule about Homer's emotional memory, about his ability to carry the specific emotional content of past moments forward into future interactions, is less consistently maintained. The Homer who has a specific, emotionally significant experience with Marge in one episode does not consistently carry the emotional texture of that experience into the next episode. He does not seem to be building up the accumulation of shared experience that characterizes a long marriage. This is different from the factual forgetting we have discussed. It is not that Homer cannot remember specific events. It is that the emotional quality of his relationship with the people he loves does not seem to accumulate across experiences in the way that real emotional relationships accumulate. Each profound moment is real within its episode. The next episode begins with Homer's emotional life. approximately where it was before the profound moment. The accumulation that should be building, the deepening of the relationship that comes from having gone through specific things together, is present as a general quality. Homer and Marge clearly have a long and layered history, but not as specific evidence that could be traced to specific episodes. The rule that experience shapes people emotionally across time has been applied to Homer globally. He is generally a person shaped by his life experiences and suspended locally the specific experiences of specific episodes do not consistently deepen him in trackable ways. Homer's relationship with his own mortality is the final dimension of his physical existence we should examine, and it is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the rule breaks. In scattered moments across the show's run, Homer confronts the reality of his own death, not in the comedic way he confronts his many near-death experiences, but in the more reflective way that middle-aged people sometimes sit with the knowledge that their time is finite. These moments are among the show's quieter and often most effective passages. Homer, without the comedy, just a person who knows he will end someday and is sitting with what that means for the family he loves. The rule established by these moments is that Homer is aware of his mortality and that this awareness has an effect on him. It makes him more present. It makes the time with his family feel more precious. It creates a specific quality of attention in the Homer who is genuinely sitting with the knowledge of finitude. The rule break is that this awareness does not persist between episodes in ways that would affect how Homer makes decisions. The Homer who sat with his mortality in one episode does not make choices in the next episode as if that sitting with had happened. He makes the same choices he would have made before the mortality confronting episode. The awareness, when it comes, is real. It simply does not leave a mark. This is the deepest version of the memory problem applied to a single character's inner life. Homer's brushes with genuine reflection on his own mortality should, in a person with a functioning continuous inner life, create a gradually deepening relationship with what matters. Each confrontation with finitude should make the next one more resonant because of what came before. In Homer's case, each confrontation with finitude is complete and self-contained. It is real in the moment. It does not connect to the next one through the continuous inner life that real mortality awareness builds. Homer's body and Homer's mind follow the same rule as Springfield itself. They hold the feeling of continuity while declining to maintain the specific content that would make that continuity fully real. And in that gap between the feeling and the specific content, between the impression of a continuous person and the actual mechanisms of that continuity, is where most of what is most interesting about Homer Simpson lives. We have discussed the floating timeline as a fact, the observation that the characters do not age across 36 years of episodes. Let us spend more time on what the floating timeline actually does to the show's storytelling and what specific rules it breaks in ways that have accumulated into something significant. The floating timeline's most immediate effect is on the backstory problem. Every character in The Simpsons has a backstory. That backstory was established at specific moments in the show's history, with reference to specific cultural and historical contexts. And the floating timeline requires that backstory to move. We have discussed this in relation to Homer and Marge's courtship, but the problem extends to every character in the show whose past has been given specific historical detail. Consider Chief Wiggum, his past as a police officer, his history with the Springfield Police Department, the specific experiences that shaped his particular brand of catastrophic incompetence. All of this has been given specific details across episodes, and all of those specific details exist in historical contexts that the floating timeline has made increasingly remote. A Wiggum who graduated from the police academy at 22 and has been on the force for 20 years should, in a world with a fixed timeline, be a specific age. The floating timeline prevents this calculation from working. Wiggum is whatever age he needs to be in any given episode, and his past is located in whatever decade produces the most useful stories or jokes. The backstory problem creates a specific rule break. The rule that a person's past is located in a specific, fixed relationship to their present. In a floating timeline, a character's past floats with them. What happened 20 years ago keeps changing based on when the current episode is set. This means that every character's history is being continuously rewritten in small ways. Not dramatically, not through retcons that fundamentally change who the character is. But the specific cultural context of their formative experiences shifts as the present shifts. The music they grew up with, the historical events that shaped their worldview, the specific texture of the era in which their character was formed. For some characters, this matters more than for others. The characters whose personalities are deeply tied to specific historical moments, characters for whom their cultural era is part of their identity, are most affected by the floating timeline's rewriting. Grandpa Simpson is the most extreme case. Abe Simpson's defining characteristic is that he is extremely old and that his extreme age has made him both a repository of historical experience and someone who cannot always distinguish that experience from things he has simply imagined or misremembered. His stories from the past, the wars, the dances, the figures he knew, the things he witnessed are part of who he is. The floating timeline has created an interesting situation for Grandpa. In the earliest seasons, his stories were set in specific, identifiable eras with consistent internal logic. The dates implied by his age and his stories aligned in ways that made a kind of sense. As the show has continued and the floating timeline has moved the present forward while keeping the characters the same age, Grandpa's past has had to shift forward with the rest of the characters' histories. This means the specific era of Grandpa's formative years has changed. The Abe Simpson who exists now, whose past floats with the timeline, is not quite the same person as the Abe Simpson of the early seasons, even though his personality and his role in the show have remained consistent. The specific memories he carries, located in whatever historical context works for each episode, are not a coherent history of a single person's life. They are a collection of period-specific stories that have not been required to all be from the same period. The rule being broken: a person's history is located in a specific sequence of time, and the stories they tell about their past should be consistent with that location. Grandpa's stories are consistent with his character, but not always with each other in terms of where they are historically located. This is not unique to Grandpa. It is the floating timeline's effect on all backstory. But it is most visible in him because his identity is so explicitly constructed around his past, and because his past is explicitly located in specific historical eras, that the floating timeline has not been able to leave undisturbed. The floating timeline creates a second category of rule break that is less discussed but potentially more significant: the problem of cultural references. The Simpsons has always been a show that uses cultural references extensively, not just as jokes, but as ways of establishing the specific cultural context the characters inhabit. What music plays on the radio? What movies they discuss? What television programs they watch? What political events they comment on? These references are part of how the show builds Springfield as a specific, inhabited world with a relationship to the larger culture. In the early seasons, these cultural references worked because the show existed in a single fixed cultural moment. The references were current and would become dated in the way all references date, but they were located consistently in the specific moment of their original broadcast. The floating timeline creates a rule about how cultural references should work in later seasons. If the characters are always living in the present moment of each episode's broadcast, then the references in each episode should be to the culture of that broadcast moment. And the show has honored this rule. Each season's references are generally contemporary to its broadcast year. But this creates a subtle but real inconsistency. In early seasons, Homer and Marge's cultural references, the music they love, the movies they grew up with, the cultural touchstones of their youth were consistent with people who were actually in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. The references felt right for the characters as established. In later seasons, the cultural references appropriate for people in their mid-30s in 2020 or 2025 are not the same references. The music Homer loves should not be the same music across 5 decades of episodes if he is always a person of his cultural moment, rather than a person of a fixed historical moment. The show handles this with varying success. Sometimes it updates the character's cultural context gracefully, letting new references replace old ones without explicitly acknowledging the shift. Sometimes it allows older references to persist in ways that feel like genuine character continuity, rather than floating timeline awkwardness. And sometimes the gap between the cultural era the characters were established in and the cultural era the floating timeline requires them to currently inhabit becomes visible in ways that feel dissonant. The rule about what cultural era these characters belong to is one that the floating timeline breaks continuously, and the breaks accumulate into a version of the Simpsons family that is slightly out of time with itself, in ways that careful viewers notice even when they cannot quite articulate what they are noticing. The floating timeline's most profound rule break, though, is the one we touched on earlier but can now examine more fully: the rule about what 36 years means. The show has been running for 36 years. The audience has been watching for 36 years. Not the same audience, obviously. The audience has turned over many times, and the average viewer of the current show is probably not someone who watched the premiere in December 1989. But the show's cultural lifespan is 36 years, and that lifespan has accumulated around the characters in ways that create a specific kind of rule break. The rule is, 36 years of cultural presence changes what characters mean. Characters who have existed in public consciousness for 36 years accrue meaning from that existence that is separate from the meaning they were given at their origin. Bart Simpson means something different in 2025 from what he meant in 1992. Not because the character has changed within the show, but because the cultural context surrounding him has changed. The floating timeline does not account for this. It cannot. The floating timeline exists to keep the characters at the ages they were when the show began, to keep them in the present tense of each broadcast moment. But it cannot prevent the accretion of cultural meaning that 36 years of existence produces. So there is now a Bart Simpson who exists within the show 10 years old, in 4th grade, perpetually mischievous, and a Bart Simpson who exists in cultural memory, who has been a cultural reference point for 3.5 decades, who adults in their 30s and 40s remember discovering as children, who has become a piece of their own personal histories. The Bart inside the show has not aged. The Bart outside the show is 30 years old in anyone's cultural memory who grew up watching him. This is the floating timeline's most fundamental rule break. Not the one about the backstories or the cultural references, but the one about the irreversibility of time in the real world. The characters cannot age within the show, but the relationship between the audience and the characters has aged in ways that the show cannot prevent and that create a genuine, felt incongruity between the story and the experience of the story. When you are 8 years old watching Bart be 10, the age gap is small and the identification is easy. When you are 40 years old watching Bart still be 10, the gap has become something different. Bart is frozen and you are not, and the relationship between you and the character has changed in ways that reflect your own aging rather than any change in the character. The floating timeline was designed to keep the show perpetually current, but across 36 years, the gap between the frozen characters and the aging audience has become something that the timeline's design cannot fully manage. This is not the show's fault. It is simply what happens when a fixed age premise meets actual time. The rule of the floating timeline that characters exist in the eternal present breaks against the unchosen rule of reality, that audiences age whether or not the characters they love do. Springfield is populated by one of the richest collections of secondary characters in the history of animated television. These characters, the ones who are not Simpsons family members but who have been established as specific, named, recurring presences in the show's world, have their own rules about who they are and what they represent. And those rules have been broken across the show's run in ways that are sometimes more dramatic than the breaks we have examined in the main family. Apu Nahasapima Petalon is the character whose rule-breaking history is most complicated because the rules around him were broken in 2 different directions: the show's internal rules about who he is, and the cultural rules about what representation means in comedy. The internal rule established early for Apu is that he is a specific, detailed person whose identity goes considerably beyond the accent and the quick E-mart. He has a PhD from Caltech. He is a genuinely accomplished person who is working at a convenience store in Springfield for reasons the show establishes and occasionally explores. His education, his ambitions, his relationship to his work and to Springfield are all more complicated than the surface character suggests. The internal rule break is that across the show's run, the complex Apu, the person with the doctorate and the complicated reasons for being where he is, appears inconsistently. The Apu the show reaches for in episodes that use him as background is often the less complex version, defined primarily by the accent and the convenience store, deployed for the specific type of joke that the character had been established for, without the complexity that the fully realized version of Apu contained. The tension between the show's complex Apu and the simplified version became inseparable from the broader cultural conversation about what the character's existence meant, which is a conversation that has been ongoing and that has genuinely affected how the character appears in the show. His appearances have become significantly less frequent in recent seasons, and the show has addressed this directly. What this means for our examination of broken rules is this: the internal rule about who Apu was, the specific, complicated person the show had established, was never consistently honored to begin with. The cultural criticism that eventually forced a reckoning with the character was responding partly to the simplified version that the show had been defaulting to, not just to the foundational choice of the character's original conception. The rule was broken from within, and then the break became impossible to ignore when the larger culture began examining it from without. Sideshow Bob's rule-breaking history is different, more purely internal to the show's storytelling, and we touched on it in the guest star section. But his relationship to consequence is worth examining in more detail here. The rule about Sideshow Bob is that he is a criminal, not a sympathetic criminal, not a redeemed criminal, but a person who has committed genuine crimes and who continues to attempt at least one more, the murder of Bart Simpson. This criminal status has real institutional consequences within the show. Bob has been to prison multiple times, has been on parole, has been under legal supervision. The rule break is in how Bob's criminal history actually functions across the show's run. Each time Bob is sent to prison, the prison appears to rehabilitate him. Not at all. He emerges with the same specific obsession with killing Bart that sent him there. The legal system in Springfield processes Bob through its mechanisms and releases him in a state that the show clearly establishes as unchanged. And this cycling through the legal system has happened enough times that the rule about what imprisonment means as a consequence for criminal behavior has been made effectively meaningless. The show acknowledges this to some degree. It is part of the ongoing joke about Bob's situation, that the mechanisms that should contain him fail repeatedly. But the acknowledgement does not resolve the rule break. Springfield's legal system, as it applies to Bob, does not follow the rules about what criminal consequences actually produce. Krusty the Clown is one of the show's longest-running secondary characters, and his rule-breaking history is one of the show's most interesting ongoing character experiments. The rule about Krusty is that he is a specific kind of person, deeply cynical about his work, carrying enormous emotional damage from his relationship with his father, reliant on substances and bad decisions in ways that affect his professional and personal life, genuinely talented in ways that his self-destructiveness prevents from fully flowering. This is a specific character with specific rules about how he operates and what drives him. And across dozens of episodes that use Krusty as their subject, these rules are honored with real care. The Krusty episodes are some of the show's more emotionally complex ones. They take the character seriously as a person whose particular combination of talent and damage is tragic in a specific and well-observed way. The rule break occurs in the episodes where Krusty is not the subject, but simply a character in Springfield's landscape. In those episodes, Krusty functions differently. He is often simpler, more purely comedic, less the specific tragic figure that the Krusty-centric episodes establish. The layer of damage and cynicism and suppressed talent is not consistently visible when the story does not require it. This creates two Krustys: the deep Krusty who shows up in his own episodes, and the functional Krusty who appears as background color in other people's stories. The deep Krusty establishes rules about who this person is. The functional Krusty operates without consistently honoring those rules. This is the pattern we have seen across every secondary character. The show builds specific, complicated people, and then uses simplified versions of those people when the story needs them in a supporting role. The simplification is not malicious, it is the practical requirement of episodic storytelling at scale, where maintaining full character complexity for every character in every scene is not feasible. But the pattern produces secondary characters who exist in two registers simultaneously, and the gap between those registers is where the rule-breaking lies. Mayor Quimby is perhaps the most purely functional secondary character in the show's main cast, defined almost entirely by his political corruption and his Kenna-esque effect, with very little of the complexity that characters like Krusty or Apu or Sideshow Bob are given. The rule about Quimby is simple. He is a corrupt politician. This rule has been applied consistently across his many appearances, but the specific nature of his corruption, what he is willing to do, how his decisions affect Springfield, what the consequences of his corruption are for the town, has been applied inconsistently. In episodes specifically about political corruption, Quimby's behavior has specific, story-relevant consequences. In other episodes, his corruption is tonal rather than consequential. It gives him a specific quality without generating any of the specific effects that corruption at the mayoral level would produce in a real town. Springfield's governance is itself a rule-breaking environment. The town's political institutions, the mayor's office, the city council, the police department, operate under rules that the show establishes in specific episodes and then suspends in others. The rule that elected officials are accountable to voters is occasionally invoked and regularly ignored. The rule that law enforcement operates under specific procedural constraints exists to be violated for comedic effect. The rule that municipal governance involves specific institutional processes is honored only when those processes serve a story. Springfield is governed, in practice, by whatever the episode needs the governance situation to be. The institution of government exists in the show's world but does not consistently function as an institution. It functions as a story element present when it is useful, absent, or simplified when it would complicate. This is a world rule break at the institutional level. The rules about how governance works, electoral accountability, institutional process, the relationship between public officials and the public exist as references and are not consistently applied as operative constraints. Dr. Julius Hibbert is a secondary character whose rule-breaking history is interesting for what it reveals about the show's relationship with professional competence. The rule about Hibbert is that he is Springfield's most respected and apparently most competent physician. He is established as someone whose medical judgment is sound, whose professional conduct is appropriate, and whose relationship with the Simpson family is one of the show's more normally functioning ongoing relationships built on genuine professional respect rather than the dysfunction that characterizes most of Springfield's institutions. The rule break is that Hibbert has, across specific episodes, demonstrated medical behaviors that do not match the competent professional the foundational rule establishes. He has laughed at patient distress. He has made diagnostic errors that a competent physician should not make. He has been used as the vehicle for medical jokes that require him to behave in ways inconsistent with the competent doctor the rule establishes. This is a character rule break similar to the ones we have seen with other secondary characters. The deep Hibbert, the genuine medical professional, exists in episodes that require medical credibility. The functional Hibbert, the comedic figure who will make the wrong call or laugh at the wrong moment for the sake of a joke, exists in episodes that require the comedy to work. What makes the Hibbert rule break interesting is that it touches on something the show has always done with professional authority. It establishes competence and then breaks it when incompetence is funnier. The rule that professionals in positions of authority are actually capable of performing their professional functions is one of the show's most consistently suspended rules. Because so much of the show's comedy depends on professional failure, Homer at the plant, Wiggum in law enforcement, Quimby in the mayor's office, and yes, Hibbert in the exam room. Springfield is a town of professionals who are professionally incompetent in specific, comedic ways, and the rules that establish their competence exist to be broken when the incompetence generates better comedy. The competence is the setup. The failure is the joke. And the audience has accepted this relationship with professional authority for so long that it has become part of Springfield's texture, part of what the town is. A place where the people in charge are largely unable to do what they are in charge of, where the institutions that should protect and serve the population serve primarily as setups for the failure jokes. This is simultaneously a specific political satire, a sustained argument about the relationship between institutional authority and actual competence in American civic life, and simply the practical requirement of a comedy that needs its secondary characters to be reliably, specifically funny. The rule break and the satire are the same thing, which might be why the rule breaking in this area feels less like a mistake and more like a thesis. There is one more category of rule breaking in The Simpsons that we have not yet directly addressed, and it might be the most fundamental: the rules about what kind of show The Simpsons is. Comedy has its own set of internal rules. Rules about what is funny and how humor works. Rules about the relationship between setup and payoff. Rules about what the comedy is for, whether it is purely entertainment or whether it is also doing something else. Rules about the register of the comedy, how broad or how subtle, how dark or how light, how closely tied to reality or how willing to abandon realistic grounding for the sake of a joke. The Simpsons has broken all of these rules across its run, and the breaks are not errors. They are the show being something more complicated than any single comedy philosophy can accommodate. The show's earliest seasons operated under a set of comedic rules that distinguished it from the existing animation landscape. It was satirical in a way that animated primetime had not been before. It was grounded in emotional realities that most animation avoided, and it used its cartoon format to explore human dynamics that live-action sitcoms were handling. but that animation had not previously reached. These were real rules about what kind of comedy the show was, and they were genuinely breaking the rules of what animated primetime television had been before. Then the show evolved. The comedy became broader in some ways. The satire became more explicit and also more generalized. The grounded emotional realities of the early seasons were sometimes replaced with a kind of emotional gestural quality, the show going through the motions of emotional beats without the specific, careful observation that gave the early emotional moments their weight. This is the most significant rule break in the show's history, because it is a break at the level of what the show is trying to do. The early show was trying to do something specific. The later show has been trying to maintain what the early show achieved while also being something different, broader, more reference-heavy, more willing to go to high-concept places that the early show would not have gone. The rules about what kind of comedy works in what kind of story have been applied inconsistently across the show's long run, and the inconsistency is most visible when you watch an episode from Season 3 and an episode from Season 24 back-to-back. They are recognizably the same show, the characters, the setting, the basic emotional relationships are all there. But the comedy operates by different rules, and the break between those rules is the single most important transition in the show's history. The show that could produce Homer's Enemy and Lisa's Substitute, and Cape Fear, and Homer at the Bat in its early seasons, was operating under a set of comedic rules that prioritized specific observation, emotional truth, and the particular kind of comedy that comes from characters behaving in ways that are simultaneously surprising and utterly characteristic. The show that operates in its later seasons uses different rules, rules that prioritize concept over character, that prioritize reference and variety over the slow accumulation of specific observation, that use the characters as vehicles for stories, rather than as the source of stories. Both sets of rules produce comedy. Both produce episodes that are enjoyable. But they are different comedic philosophies, and the show has lived inside both of them, while presenting itself as continuous, as the same show, as The Simpsons. The rule being broken is the rule about what this show is. The early answer and the later answer are not the same answer. The show has never acknowledged the transition, because acknowledging it would require either defending the change or reversing it, and neither is possible. So the show continues, as it always has, presenting itself as a continuous thing while being, in important respects, several different things across its long history. This is the most fundamental rule break. Not a factual error, not a geographic inconsistency, not a character detail that does not match a previous episode, but a break in the show's relationship with its own deepest purpose, the question of what this comedy is actually for and what it is trying to do. The early show had a specific answer to that question. The answer was, to look at this specific family and this specific town and this specific version of American life with a sharp and loving and sorrowful attention, and to find in that attention both humor and genuine feeling. The later show has a different answer. The answer is to be The Simpsons, which is now a genre unto itself, with its own established conventions and expectations and pleasures that are separate from any specific creative philosophy. Both answers have value. The second answer is, in a sense, the natural conclusion of what the first answer produced. You cannot do something that well for that long without the thing becoming a genre of itself. The Simpsons cannot not be The Simpsons. But the break between the first answer and the second one is the deepest rule the show has broken in its 36-year history. And it is the one that most of the show's fans, when they talk about the difference between the early seasons and the later ones, are trying to describe without quite having the language for it. They are describing a rule break. The biggest one, the one that everything else flows from. And somehow, despite it, the show is still there, still running, still The Simpsons, still, against all the odds of 36 years of rule-breaking, still capable of the occasional moment that makes you feel exactly the way those early episodes made you feel, which might be the most impressive rule break of all, the rule that nothing this old stays this itself, and yet here it is. Here it is. There is a piece of The Simpsons that airs before every single episode that has its own complicated relationship with the show's rules, and it is one that almost never gets examined carefully, because it is designed to be absorbed rather than analyzed. The opening sequence, The Simpsons opening the DO to Bart's chalkboard to the school hallway to Lisa's saxophone to the family assembling on the couch, is one of the most recognizable pieces of television in history. It has been watched, by any reasonable estimate, billions of times. It is the frame through which the show announces itself to its audience every week, and it has been doing so since 1989. The opening sequence also breaks rules. Constantly, deliberately, and in ways that are more interesting than they might initially appear. The couch gag is the most obvious version of this. Every episode, the family races to the couch and something happens. In the early seasons, what happened was relatively simple. A visual joke, often a simple variation on the assembly. As the show developed, the couch gag became increasingly elaborate, increasingly self-referential, increasingly willing to be something entirely outside the show's normal register, animated by guest directors in styles completely foreign to the show's visual language, running for longer than a normal television sequence would permit, depicting things that have no connection to the episode that follows. The rule being broken is the rule about what the opening sequence is for. An opening sequence is supposed to introduce the show to orient the audience, to establish the world, to signal what kind of experience they are about to have. The Simpsons opening sequence does these things, and then the couch gag does something else entirely. It signals that the show's self-awareness of its own nature is so developed that it can use this foundational, repeated element to comment on itself, to play, to go somewhere completely different from where the episode will go. The couch gag has become a rule-breaking mechanism embedded into the show's most rule-defining space. The opening, which should establish the rules, instead demonstrates every week that the show's relationship to its own rules is playful rather than binding. But the opening sequence's rule-breaking goes deeper than the couch gag. The sequence itself has changed across the show's run in ways that are infrequently examined. The original opening sequence established specific rules about Springfield's spatial layout. The path from Bart's school to the Simpson home, the visual journey that the opening traces, implies specific geographic relationships between the show's locations. The elementary school is in one place relative to the power plant, which is in one place relative to Evergreen Terrace. These implied relationships are established in the opening and then contradicted across the episodes themselves, which depict these same locations in different spatial relationships. The opening also established specific rules about the characters' lives. Marge at the supermarket, Homer at the plant, Bart at school, Lisa in the music room. These are not just visual moments. They are statements about who these people are and what their days look like. The rules implied by these specific images have been broken across the show's run in the ways we have already examined. But it is worth noting that the breaking of those rules began at the level of the opening sequence itself, which depicts a version of the characters' daily lives that individual episodes have never consistently matched. The saxophone moment in the opening is a specific rule statement about Lisa. She plays the saxophone, she plays it in school, she plays it as an expression of who she is that is present even in the routine moments of her day. This is honored in Lisa-centric episodes and present as background in others, but the specific quality of the saxophone moment, the particular way her playing fills the school hallway, the way the teacher's exasperated response is met with Lisa's undimmed continuation, establishes a rule about what the saxophone means to Lisa that is not always honored in episodes where her playing is either absent or treated as a different kind of thing. The opening sequence's visual evolution across the show's run is itself a catalog of rule adjustments. When the sequence was updated in later seasons with HD animation, with different visual textures, with the addition and removal of specific elements, each update changed the rules implied by the opening in subtle ways. The Springfield that the current opening implies is not quite the same as the Springfield the original opening implied. The characters have different visual qualities. The journey through town suggests different things about the town's character. Each opening is a statement about what the show is, and the show has updated that statement multiple times across 36 years, each time breaking the rules the previous statement established. There is a conversation that exists around The Simpsons that is itself a kind of rule about the show, a rule that the audience has established through collective consensus about what the show was, when it was best, and what it has failed to be since. The Golden Age narrative says that The Simpsons was one thing during its peak seasons, roughly seasons 3 through 8, with arguments extending in either direction, and became something different after that peak. The narrative locates specific episodes as definitive expressions of what the show was at its best. Homer at the bat, Marge versus the monorail, Cape Fear, Homer's triple bypass, last exit to Springfield, Bart gets an F, The Way We Was, Lisa's substitute. A loose canon of episodes that the show's critical audience uses as the reference point against which everything else is measured. This collective narrative about the show's peak has become its own rule, an external rule imposed by audience consensus rather than an internal rule established by the show itself. And the show has been breaking this external rule continuously since the Golden Age ended. The meta rule says, the show should be what those great episodes were. The show should operate at that level of emotional specificity, that quality of observation, that balance between comedy and feeling. Every episode that does not reach that level is, in some sense, breaking the rule that the great episodes established. This is not a fair rule. It is not a rule the show agreed to. It is a rule the audience imposed based on what the show was capable of at a specific moment in its history, and it is a standard that almost no long-running creative work could maintain across decades of continuous production. But it is real. And the show's relationship with its own golden age, the way it gestures back toward those seasons, the way it occasionally produces an episode that operates in something like that register, the way it has incorporated self-awareness of the golden age narrative into its self-referential humor, is itself a kind of ongoing negotiation with a rule it cannot quite satisfy and cannot ignore. The Golden Age rule also creates a specific kind of rule break in how the show handles nostalgia. Because the show has become nostalgic for itself, for the version of itself that the Golden Age represents, and this self-nostalgia appears across its later seasons in ways that create their own set of consistency. Problems. When the later show references the early show, when it uses specific shots or phrases or moments that echo the classic episodes, it is doing two things simultaneously. It is honoring its own history, paying respect to what it was. And it is implicitly acknowledging the gap between that history and its present, between what those references represent and what the current episode is. This self-referential nostalgia is a kind of rule break because it inserts the past version of the show into the present version in ways that highlight the difference, rather than bridging it. The echo is recognizable but not quite right. The homage is present, but the thing being homaged is not fully there. The Golden Age rule, the external rule imposed by audience consensus, has become part of the show's internal reality. It is a rule the show carries with it, a rule it sometimes lives up to, often falls short of, and occasionally, in its best later moments, comes close enough to that the gap momentarily closes. And in those moments, the later episodes that briefly touch the quality of the early ones, the rule-breaking and the rule-honoring exist simultaneously. The show breaks the rule by not being what it was. And then it honors the rule by being, just for a moment, exactly what it was. That simultaneous breaking and honoring is perhaps the most characteristic thing about The Simpsons in its later years. Not the choice to break the rule, not the choice to honor it, but the ongoing attempt to do both at once, across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, in a town where time has stopped and the family is always coming home. Let us spend some time in specific territory. Rather than the broad patterns we have been examining, we will go into a handful of specific episodes and trace in detail how each one breaks the rules that the show has established and what those specific breaks reveal about the show's relationship with itself. The episode Bart Gets Famous from Season 5 is a good starting point because it breaks a rule that seems minor and turns out to be foundational. In the episode, Bart becomes a celebrity based on a single accidental phrase, a line that catches the cultural moment and turns him into a media phenomenon. The episode uses this premise to examine what celebrity means, what it does to people, and how quickly it can evaporate. It is a good episode, sharp and specific about the mechanics of sudden fame. The rule it breaks is the rule about Bart's relationship with the outside world. Early Springfield's rules implied a specific kind of boundary between the town and the larger culture. Springfield was responsive to the culture outside it, but not a place that the outside culture regularly reached into. Individual Springfield residents occasionally had brush with wider fame or wider consequence, but the town itself existed at a remove from celebrity culture's center. Bart Gets Famous has Bart become nationally recognized, a specific kind of celebrity whose phrase is on television, on merchandise, in the national conversation. This is a larger breach of Springfield's insularity than the show's early rules implied. The rule said Springfield was a place where fame of that scale did not quite reach down into the particulars of individual residents' lives. The episode breaks that rule in service of the premise. The break is justified by the story it enables. But it is a break. And once Bart has been nationally famous, Once the show has established that Springfield residents can reach national celebrity, the rule about Springfield's insularity from the wider culture is softened in ways that accumulate across later episodes. Selma's choice from Season 4 breaks a rule about Marge's sisters in ways that are interesting because the break is also the most emotionally honest thing the show has ever done with those characters. The rule about Patty and Selma is that they are a specific kind of comic presence, defined by their smoking, their mutual contempt for Homer, their particular texture of embittered middle age, their relationship with a version of popular culture that the show uses as a joke rather than as a genuine character detail. They are supporting characters in the best sense. They provide specific kinds of comedy with specific reliability. Selma's choice breaks the rule about Selma by taking her desire to have a child, a desire that the show has referenced but not fully explored, and making it the episode's genuine emotional center. The episode goes to a place with Selma that the established rule about her comedic function would not normally allow. It takes seriously something the rule said was background detail. The break is executed with care. The episode does not abandon what makes Selma comedically specific. It goes to the emotional reality underneath the comic surface and finds something real there. This is the best version of a character rule break, one where the rule is broken in service of greater truth about who the character is. And then the rule reasserts itself. In subsequent episodes, Selma's desire for a child given such specific weight in this episode is present as a character note but not as the emotional reality the episode made it. The break was genuine but not permanent. Selma's emotional complexity returned to background status. Bart Sells His Soul from Season 7 is perhaps the episode whose rule breaks are most philosophically interesting, because the episode itself is a meditation on what rules mean. The premise is that Bart sells his soul written on a piece of paper to Milhouse for $5. The episode takes this transaction seriously in a specific way. It traces what losing the soul actually does to Bart, in ways that are not quite supernatural but that suggest the soul's absence is genuinely felt. Animals do not respond to Bart. Automatic doors do not open for him. He cannot laugh from the gut. The soul's absence is real within the episode's logic. The rule this episode establishes is that souls are real in Springfield's world, that they have tangible existence, that their presence or absence affects how a person moves through the world. This is a world rule. Springfield is a place where spiritual reality has physical effect. The rule is broken by the episode's own resolution, where Bart's soul is restored and everything returns to normal. But more significantly, it is broken by the show's ongoing treatment of spiritual and supernatural elements across its run, which is inconsistent in ways that the Soul episode's careful establishment cannot fully survive. The Simpsons has depicted God, angels, demons, and supernatural events across dozens of episodes with varying degrees of seriousness and varying implications for the show's metaphysical rules. Sometimes the supernatural elements are real within the show's world. Sometimes they are dream sequences or wish fulfillment fantasies. Sometimes they are satirical deployments of religious imagery that the show does not quite commit to as real. The rules about what Springfield's relationship to the supernatural actually is have never been fully settled. Bart Sells His Soul is one of the episodes that takes the supernatural most seriously and most specifically. Its careful treatment of what the soul is and what its absence means establishes a rule about Springfield's metaphysical reality. And then the show's ongoing inconsistency about the supernatural means that rule is maintained in some episodes and suspended in others. The Soul episode is one of the show's best. It is also a rule, a specific, carefully established rule about what the world of Springfield contains that cannot be fully integrated into the show's broader treatment of the same territory, because that broader treatment is too various to be constrained by any single episode's philosophy. 22 short films about Springfield from Season 7 breaks a rule so fundamental it is barely recognized as a rule. The rule that an episode of The Simpsons is about The Simpsons. The episode is structured as a series of short vignettes about Springfield's secondary characters, with the Simpsons family present only peripherally. It is not an episode about Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie. It is an episode about Springfield as a place with its own life that exists independent of the family at its center. This is a rule break of a specific and interesting kind. It breaks the rule about what the show's perspective is. The Simpsons has always been nominally organized around the family. The opening sequence, the title, the critical mass of stories have all centered on the 5 people in the house on Evergreen Terrace. 22 Short Films steps back from that organization and looks at Springfield from a different perspective. It implies a rule about the show that the show has not consistently followed, that Springfield is the real protagonist, that the family is one element in a larger world, that the stories worth telling extend significantly beyond the household we always return to. The episode is beautiful. It is among the show's most ambitious and most successful experiments. And the rule it implies about what the show could be centered on place rather than family, on community rather than household, is a rule that the show has honored only occasionally in its other episodes. In the rare instances where Springfield itself is treated as the character, the rule break here is aspirational rather than erroneous. The episode establishes a possibility that the show has never fully committed to: a Springfield-centered show rather than a family-centered show. The rule that 22 Short Films implies would produce a different kind of Simpsons, broader, more distributed, more about the texture of a community than about the specific dynamics of a specific family. That show would be remarkable. It exists in fragments, in episodes like this one, scattered across 36 years. The rule it would require has been established and not followed through, which might be the most interesting rule break in the show's history. Not a contradiction of something established, not a forgetting of something committed to, but a road not taken, a version of the show that one episode proposed and 36 subsequent seasons have not explored fully. The road is still there, the rule is still established. Springfield still exists as a place with its own life beyond the family story. The show just keeps taking a different road. Every week. Every episode. Back to Evergreen Terrace. Back to the couch. Back to the family, who are always there, who are always the same ages, who are always the beginning and the end of every story. The road not taken runs alongside the one the show has taken for 36 years. And sometimes, in the best episodes, you can see them both at once. We have discussed the floating timeline as a general principle, but the way the floating timeline creates specific, episode-level rule breaks deserves its own careful examination, because the breaks at that level are more dramatic and more visibly paradoxical than the general principle suggests. Consider the episode Lisa's Wedding from Season 6. This is a flash-forward episode, a glimpse into a specific possible future for the Simpson family, set in 2010. Hitch was at the time of broadcast approximately 15 years away. The episode depicts Lisa as a young adult, in love, navigating her relationship with her family from the perspective of someone who has had 15 years to develop beyond the 8-year-old the show presents as current. The rules this episode establishes are specific and carefully drawn. Future Lisa is at Oxford. She is engaged to an upper-class Englishman. She has retained her essential character, the intelligence, the moral seriousness, the particular way she sees the world, while having developed in ways that are recognizably continuous with the 8-year-old, but also genuinely different. She is not just a taller Lisa, she is a developed version of Lisa. The episode also establishes specific things about the future of other characters. Homer has aged but remains recognizably Homer. Marge is present with the specific qualities she has always had. Bart is an adult whose specific adult version is carefully observed. These are rules. They say, if time passes in the way time normally passes, this is what these characters become. The show has imagined its own future and committed to a specific version of it. But the floating timeline means this future is impossible. The Lisa who is 8 in 1995 cannot be 23 in 2010, because the Lisa who is 8 in 1995 is still 8 in 2010. The future the episode establishes is in direct contradiction to the rule the floating timeline establishes. The show acknowledges this, in its way. The episode is framed as a vision of a possible future, not a prophecy of an actual one. It is explicitly positioned as a what might have been, rather than a what will be. The framing gives the show an out. This future is conditional, not definitive. But the emotional content of the episode is not conditional. The specific future it imagines for Lisa, the specific person she becomes, the specific relationship she almost abandons her family for, the specific moment of choosing her imperfect, beloved family over the seemingly perfect future, is played with full emotional commitment. It is one of the show's most moving half hours. The rule break is that the emotional commitment the episode makes is incompatible with the framing that protects the floating timeline. You cannot have a conditional future and a fully committed emotional experience of that future simultaneously. The conditionality undercuts the emotion. The emotion undermines the conditionality. The episode tries to have both and nearly succeeds, which is itself a kind of rule-breaking achievement. It breaks the rule that you cannot simultaneously commit to something and hedge against it, and it gets away with the break through the quality of the execution. The Treehouse of Horror episodes break the rules of the floating timeline in the opposite direction, not by imagining futures, but by imagining alternate presents where different things are true. In these episodes, the characters are not the characters of the canonical show, but versions of them that inhabit different stories. The rules are suspended entirely. Anything can happen, and its happening has no consequences for the canonical Springfield. This is the floating timeline's most extreme expression. The acknowledgement that there are versions of the story where the characters can be anything, do anything, die, change, become radically different versions of themselves, and the canonical story remains unaffected. The Treehouse episodes are the show being maximally honest about its own nature. They are the show saying, the rules are rules only in the context where we have agreed to apply them. Outside that context, anything is possible. And inside that context, inside canonical Springfield, the rules apply not because they are binding, but because both the show and the audience have agreed to treat them as binding. The floating timeline is not a physical law, it is a social contract. And the Treehouse episodes are the show demonstrating, every Halloween, exactly what happens when the social contract is suspended. The specific rule breaks of the Treehouse episodes are too numerous to catalog here. But the meta rule they collectively establish is worth stating clearly. The rules of canonical Springfield are choices, not laws. They are maintained by agreement, not by necessity. And the show knows this, and occasionally shows you what the world without the agreement looks like. The world without the agreement is stranger, darker, and more various than canonical Springfield. It is also, arguably, more honest about what fiction is and what it requires. Canonical Springfield is the version of the story where the agreement holds. Every other version is a Treehouse episode. And the choice to maintain the agreement to keep canonical Springfield running with its specific rules intact, even as those rules are broken in small ways every week, is the choice that has kept this show alive for 36 years. The choice to keep the agreement, the choice to come back to the couch, the choice to let Bart be 10 and Homer be whatever age middle age is, and Marge be patient and Lisa be brilliant and Maggie be silent. The choice, made every week for 36 years, to be the Simpsons. That is the deepest rule, the one that has never been broken. There is a dimension of rule-breaking in The Simpsons that is easy to overlook because it operates at such a small scale that individual instances rarely register. The rules of how language works in Springfield. These are rules about how characters speak, what words they use, what register they inhabit, and what their particular uses of language reveal about who they are. Every recurring character in The Simpsons has a specific verbal identity. Homer's vocabulary, syntax, and speech patterns are among the most precisely observed in the show's history. His particular way of moving from thought to thought, the specific things that can interrupt his train of thinking mid-sentence, the characteristic sound of his responses to situations, including the wordless ones that have become iconic. These verbal patterns are rules about who Homer is. His specific voice, not just Dan Castellaneta's vocal performance, but the character's particular relationship to language is part of his identity. The rule breaks in Homer's verbal identity are subtle but real. The early Homer speech has a specific quality of deadpan sincerity, a way of meaning exactly what he says that is different from the more overtly comedic verbal register of later seasons. The later Homer speech is more broadly comic, more reliably played for immediate laugh impact, less capable of the specific kind of quiet truth that the early Homer's verbal style made possible. This is a character rule break that operates at the level of voice, rather than action or history. The Homer who says something in a way that could only be Homer in the show's classic seasons is slightly different from the Homer who says things in the way later seasons require. The difference is subtle enough to require direct comparison to make visible, but it is real. Lisa's verbal identity is arguably the most precisely established in the show. She is the character most defined by how she speaks, by the specific vocabulary and sentence structures and argumentative patterns that mark her as the most intellectually sophisticated person in any room she inhabits. The rule about Lisa's speech is that it is specific. She uses language in ways that are characteristic and that signal her particular kind of intelligence. The rule break occurs when Lisa is used for comedy that requires her to speak in ways that are simpler or more broadly comic than her established verbal identity allows. The quick joke sometimes requires a Lisa who speaks in a way that the specific, carefully observed Lisa would not. The episode's comedic rhythm sometimes requires a Lisa who responds to situations with blunter language than her established verbal patterns. These are small breaks. Individual instances are barely noticeable. But across 36 years of episodes, the accumulation of moments where Lisa speaks slightly below her established register creates a version of her verbal identity that is softer and less specific than the rule would suggest. Homer's catchphrases deserve specific attention because they represent a particular kind of rule breaking. The rules about what catchphrases mean. The do began as a specific, characterful expression. Homer's particular vocalization of the moment when something goes wrong, specific enough to be immediately recognizable as his and not anyone else's. It was rule establishing rather than rule breaking. It said, "This is what Homer sounds like when the world fails to cooperate with him." The rule it then breaks, across years of use, is the rule about what makes a character expression specific. DO has become so universally recognized, so detached from any particular Homer-specific moment, and attached instead to the general concept of mistake or frustration, that it now carries cultural weight that is separate from and in some ways heavier than its character weight. When Homer says dough in a current episode, the sound is carrying 36 years of cultural usage, and the character moment is competing with all of that accumulated weight. This is what happens to iconic character expressions over very long periods of use. They transcend the character and become the culture, and then when the character uses them, the use is both authentic, Homer is saying dough, and self-referential, dough is The Simpsons, and The Simpsons is invoking itself. The rule about what the expression means has expanded beyond what the original establishment of the rule intended. Dough as a character rule has become D-O as a cultural rule. And every time Homer says it now, both versions of the rule are present simultaneously. The rules about how formal and informal language coexist in Springfield are another ongoing source of interesting rule-breaking. Springfield is a place where wildly different registers of speech coexist in ways that real American communities manage, but rarely with the specific concentration that Springfield achieves. Characters speak in ways that simultaneously invoke high cultural literacy and vernacular. Springfield Lisa can quote philosophy and then talk to Bart in his register. Homer can be eloquent about his love for his family and then respond to a technical question with a level of verbal incomprehension that makes his eloquence seem impossible. This coexistence is one of the show's most characteristic achievements in early seasons. It is part of what makes Springfield feel real in a particular way, because real American communities do contain this kind of register plurality. But the rules about when each register applies and which characters have access to which levels of language have been applied inconsistently across the show's run. Characters who should, based on their established verbal intelligence, be incapable of certain kinds of sophisticated linguistic engagement, occasionally demonstrate that engagement when the joke requires it. Characters who should have consistent access to sophisticated language occasionally speak in simpler registers than their establishment would support. The comedy often needs specific registers at specific moments, and the rules about which characters have access to which registers bend to accommodate those needs. The bend is usually small. The accumulation across decades is not small. These verbal rule breaks are perhaps the least discussed category of rule breaking in The Simpsons, partly because they operate below the level of plot and character event, and partly because individual instances are so quickly absorbed by the broader context of an episode. A single moment where Homer speaks slightly more eloquently than his established verbal identity allows is gone in seconds. The next joke arrives. The episode moves on. But the cumulative effect of 1,000 such moments is the slight softening of the very specific verbal identities that made the show's characters so distinctively themselves in the early seasons. The voices are all still recognizable. The specific quality of those voices, the precise verbal particularity that made each character feel like a person who could only exist in Springfield, is somewhat less sharp than it was. This is the most intimate version of the floating timeline. Not the timeline that keeps the characters at specific ages, but the timeline that keeps their voices at the precise register the early show established. That more intimate timeline has been floating too, drifting across 36 years, adjusting the specific texture of how these people speak in ways that are nearly invisible, but that add up to something significant. The Simpsons is still The Simpsons. Homer still sounds like Homer. Lisa still sounds like Lisa. The verbal identities are maintained at the level that matters for recognition. But the level below recognition, the precise, specific, irreducibly individual quality that the best early episodes captured, has been gently loosened. The rules that govern that precise level have been broken by time and volume and the natural drift of long-form storytelling. And in that loosening, in that gentle drift, in the slow softening of what was once so sharp, there is something that is both a loss and an inevitability. Everything that runs for 36 years drifts. Everything that has said the same things thousands of times adjusts, imperceptibly, the specific way it says them. The Simpsons has drifted. The rules have bent. The voices have changed in the specific way that all voices change across time, still recognizably themselves, but carrying the weight of all those years in the particular way they sound. That weight is not a flaw. It is the evidence of duration, the proof that the show has survived long enough to be shaped by its own history. And survival, for a show this old, is its own kind of achievement, its own kind of rule. The rule that says, some things last, some things keep going. Some things find a way to remain themselves, even as they change, even as the rules bend and the geography shifts and the characters forget and the couch gags get stranger and the golden age recedes further into memory. Some things last. The Simpsons lasts. Imperfect, rule-breaking, inconsistent, beloved, broken, and whole Springfield lasts. And somewhere in that lasting, in the specific, stubborn fact of it, is the answer to every question we have spent this night asking. Why does the show break its own rules? Because rules are what you establish when you start. And 36 years later, you are not starting. You are continuing. You are surviving. You are doing what very few things in the history of television have ever managed to do, which is to still be here, still running. Still, somehow, still The Simpsons. The rules bend because the show lives inside time, and nothing that lives inside time can remain perfectly what it was. The rules hold because the thing that matters most, the feeling of coming home, of settling onto that couch with that family in that impossible town, is as present in the 800th episode as it was in the first. And that is the rule that has never been broken, the rule that underlies all the rules. The rule the show has maintained across every inconsistency, every retcon, every forgotten catastrophe and revised backstory and geographic impossibility. The rule that says, this family is home. And home is always exactly where you left it, right there, on the other side of the opening credits, waiting, like it always has been, like it always will be. There is a particular kind of continuity that television shows maintain, not through plot threads and character arcs, but through the accumulated emotional weight of relationships, the specific texture of how particular people relate to each other that develops over time and becomes one of the show's most valuable assets. This is different from factual continuity. It is harder to maintain, harder to identify when it breaks, and harder to repair when it does. The Simpsons has built some of the richest ongoing relationships in the history of American comedy, and it has broken the rules of those relationships in ways that are sometimes invisible and sometimes impossible to miss. Let us begin with the relationship that defines the show, Homer and Marge. We have already addressed some of the structural rule breaks in their marriage, the way crises resolve without leaving the lasting marks they should, the way the origin story has been rewritten multiple times to accommodate the floating timeline. But the texture of the marriage, the specific, day-to-day emotional reality of how these two particular people inhabit their relationship, has its own history of rule-breaking that is separate from the structural issues. The rule about Homer and Marge's daily dynamic, established in the early seasons, is that it is a specific kind of relationship. Homer is not exactly a good husband in the technical sense. He is inattentive, self-focused, prone to decisions that affect Marge without consulting her, and frequently oblivious to things that matter to her. But he loves her in a way that the show depicts as real and as occasionally able to break through his obliviousness in moments that matter. Marge is patient in a way that goes beyond ordinary patience. She extends Homer a charity that is greater than what most relationships could sustain, but she is also clear about what she needs, about what the limits of her patience are, about the specific things Homer fails to provide that she genuinely misses. This specific dynamic, the specific texture of this particular marriage between these particular people, is established carefully enough in the early seasons to constitute a rule. The Homer-Marge relationship has a specific character, and that character generates specific kinds of stories and specific kinds of emotional moments. The rule break is that across 36 years, the specific character of the marriage has drifted. Not dramatically, not in ways that can be pinpointed to a single episode. But the Homer of Season 25 relates to Marge in ways that are subtly different from the Homer of Season 3, and the difference is not explained by character growth or development within the show. It is explained by the show's needs changing over time, by different writing teams having slightly different instincts about what the marriage is, by comedy styles evolving, by the specific jokes available about a particular kind of relationship becoming worn through repetition and requiring replacement with different jokes about a slightly different kind of relationship. The marriage has been written and rewritten, gradually and without announcement, across decades. The fundamental structure, they love each other, they stay together, the family holds, has been preserved. The specific texture of the relationship within that structure has not. This is perhaps the most important kind of rule break in the show's history, because the texture is where the meaning lies. The plot-level story of Homer and Marge's marriage has remained consistent. The felt experience of being in that marriage, what it looks like from the inside, what it costs, what it gives, has changed in ways that the show's fans often sense but cannot quite articulate. The easiest way to see this is to watch an early season Homer-Marge scene and a later season one back-to-back, and to pay attention not to what is being said but to the quality of attention each character pays to the other. In the early seasons, there is a specific kind of seeing each other in their exchanges, a sense that Homer is sometimes genuinely present with Marge in a way that is particular to him and to her and to the history they share. In later seasons, that quality of attention is often replaced by something more generically warm, but less specific. The relationship's rules have been broken at the level of detail. The headline has been maintained. The details have drifted. The show's treatment of death is its own complex, ongoing rule-breaking situation, and it is one that touches almost everything else we have discussed. The foundational rule about death in The Simpsons is that it is reversible. This is established early and clearly through Hans Moleman's repeated deaths, through the Treehouse of Horror episodes, through the general cartoon physics of the show's comedy. Death is not the end in Springfield. Characters die and return. Events of lethal scale are survived. The rule is, this show does not permanently kill characters, because comedy requires resilience and because the characters who die are needed for future episodes. Then the show breaks this rule. It breaks it carefully, with specific characters, in ways that are presented as permanent. The deaths of Maud Flanders, of Edna Krabappel handled through the death of the voice actress, of Frank Grimes, of other specific characters across the show's run. These are deaths that the show has committed to in the sense that the characters do not return. The rule break in these cases is not that they die. The rule break is that the show maintains two simultaneous and contradictory death rules. Death is reversible in cartoon terms, in Treehouse of Horror terms, in Hans Moleman terms. Death is permanent, for specific named characters who are given genuine departures. Both rules are true. Neither overrides the other. A character's death in Springfield can be either permanent or temporary, depending on which rule the show is applying at that moment, and there is no consistent principle that determines which rule applies. Frank Grimes's death is particularly interesting as a rule break, because his episode, Homer's Enemy, is one of the show's most deliberately meta-commentaries on its own rules. The episode introduces Grimes as a character whose entire purpose is to react to Springfield's rules as if they were real-world rules. Grimes is a normal person in a cartoon town. He responds to Homer's impossibility with the horror that a normal person would feel. He is driven to madness and death by the cognitive dissonance of inhabiting a world where Homer's behavior has no consequences. The episode explicitly makes the show's rule-breaking its subject. Grimes is the audience's representative within Springfield, the person who notices the rules being broken and cannot survive the noticing. His death is the show arguing that awareness of Springfield's impossibility is itself fatal. You cannot live in Springfield and see it clearly at the same time. This is a rule break disguised as commentary. The episode breaks the rule that Springfield is a livable place for Grimes, while simultaneously analyzing why that rule break is necessary, because a world that follows the show's rules cannot contain a person who perceives those rules clearly. It is the most honest thing the show has done about its own nature, and it did it by destroying a character who told the truth. Grimes's son appeared in a later episode, seeking revenge for his father's death, which created the implication that Grimes's death had lasting consequences for at least one person in Springfield. This is one of the more notable moments in the show's history of honoring a death in a way that generates ongoing story, the rare case where the rule that deaths have consequences was applied to a death that had been presented as significant. The relationship between Homer and Bart is another ongoing dynamic whose rules have been applied with marked inconsistency across the show's run. The rule established early is that Homer and Bart have a specific and complicated relationship. Homer's love for his son is real but frequently expressed through strangling, which the show presents as comedic but also as genuinely representative of something about the relationship. The gap between Homer's intentions and his execution, the ways his love fails to reach Bart in forms that Bart can receive. Bart's relationship to his father is similarly layered. He provokes Homer, sometimes deliberately and specifically, in ways that are about testing and about connection simultaneously. In the show's best moments, the Homer-Bart relationship is one of its most emotionally rich ongoing dynamics. The specific way this father and this son see each other with simultaneous frustration and love, with an inability to communicate that is constantly being overcome through acts that are not communication, has been the basis for some of the show's most effective storytelling. The rule break is that this richness is not consistently present. Episodes that use Homer and Bart as a comedic duo often reduce the specific texture of their relationship to the broadly functional version. Homer is frustrated by Bart, Bart provokes Homer. The frustration generates comedy. The specific quality of seeing each other that the best episodes establish is not consistently there. This is the same pattern we have noted in other relationships. The specific version exists in the episodes that specifically require it. The functional version appears in episodes where the relationship serves a supporting role. And the gap between the specific version and the functional version, accumulated across hundreds of episodes, means that the rule about what Homer and Bart are to each other has been broken by repetition rather than by contradiction. The strangling is the most visible symbol of this dynamic, and also the most clear sight of its rule-breaking history. In early seasons, the strangling is presented as almost reflexive. Homer grabs Bart's throat when provoked in a way that the show treats as simultaneously extreme and characteristic. It is a joke, but a joke that is doing some real work about what this relationship is and what its failures look like. Across later seasons, the strangling has appeared less frequently and has been treated differently when it does appear, sometimes ironically, sometimes as a reference to the show's own history, sometimes in ways that seem to acknowledge that the gag has become complex through decades of use. The gradual evolution of how the strangling is deployed tracks the broader evolution of how seriously the show takes the Homer-Bart relationship's darker dimensions. The rule about what the strangling means has been rewritten across decades. It started as a specific comedic shorthand for a specific kind of relationship. It became an iconic element of the show's identity. And its current status is somewhere between those two, still recognizable, still used, but carrying the weight of every previous use in a way that changes what it means in any given instance. Secondary relationships in the show have their own history of rule-breaking, often more dramatic and less discussed than the main families. Ned Flanders' relationship with Homer is one of the show's most carefully maintained ongoing dynamics. The show has honored the fundamental structure of this relationship with more consistency than almost any other. Ned likes Homer more than Homer deserves. Homer takes Ned for granted in specific and ongoing ways. The gap between what Ned offers and what Homer returns is a constant in the show's world. But the specific quality of what Ned feels toward Homer has shifted across the show's run in ways that are worth noting. Early Ned's regard for Homer contains genuine warmth and something close to admiration. Ned sees something in Homer that Homer does not see in himself, and this vision is part of what makes the relationship interesting. Later, Ned's regard for Homer is more clearly structured by Ned's religious commitment to loving his neighbor rather than by any specific thing he sees in Homer. The love is still there, but its basis has changed. This is a character rule evolution rather than a simple break. The show has given a reason for the change. Ned's psychology, revealed across multiple episodes, provides a framework for understanding why his regard for Homer is now more principled than perceptual. But the rule about why Ned feels what he feels has been rewritten in ways the show has not explicitly acknowledged. The Moe's Tavern relationships are their own ongoing soap opera of rule-breaking and continuity. Moe's friendship group Homer, Barney, Lenny, Carl has a specific texture that the show has established across many episodes. These are men who have been drinking at the same bar for decades, who have a specific kind of camaraderie that is built on shared time and shared lowered ambitions, and the particular comfort of people who know each other well enough to not have to explain themselves. This texture is real when the show invokes it carefully, and it is replaced by a more functional version of the friendship whenever individual episodes need the characters to behave in ways that the established dynamic would not support. Barney in episodes about his drinking history is a different Barney from the one who appears as background in other episodes. Lenny and Carl are most fully drawn when they are the episode's focus. When they are supporting cast, they flatten into their defining traits. Barney's sobriety is the most dramatic rule break in the Tavern Group's history. In Season 11, Barney became sober. This was presented as a genuine, lasting character change, the kind of thing that should permanently alter Barney's role in the show's world and his relationships with the characters whose lives have been organized partly around his drinking. The sobriety did not stick consistently. Barney's relationship to alcohol has fluctuated across the episodes that followed his sobriety storyline. Sometimes he is sober. Sometimes he is drinking. The show has not maintained the sobriety as the permanent change it was presented as, nor has it narratively addressed why the sobriety ended or what Barney's current status is. This is a rule Barney is sober that was established with real emotional weight and then broken through gradual inconsistency rather than through any specific reversal. Barney is another thing Springfield forgot. The Simpsons' treatment of romantic relationships outside the main family is its own catalog of broken rules. The show has established romantic relationships for many of its secondary characters, pursued those relationships across episodes, and then resolved, discontinued, or simply stopped acknowledging them in ways that are rarely explained. Principal Skinner and Edna Krabappel's relationship is the most notable. This was a genuine, ongoing romantic storyline that the show developed across multiple seasons, not just a single episode, but a real attempt to depict two specific people finding each other. The relationship had its own internal logic, its own specific texture, its own emotional stakes, and the show honored it with real care for a significant portion of its run. Then Krabappel died, and the relationship's ongoing story ended with her. But the rule about what the Skinner-Krabappel relationship had been, what it meant for both characters, what it established about Skinner as a person capable of connection, was not carried forward in a consistent way into Skinner's subsequent characterization. He became, more or less, the version of Skinner that existed before the relationship, the particular combination of authority and inadequacy that the show uses most consistently for comedy. The relationship happened. The rules it established about who Skinner is as a person were honored within those episodes. And then the relationship's lasting effect on the character's ongoing characterization was considerably less than those rules implied it should be. This is the death and consequence rule applied to relationships. Just as deaths are supposed to have lasting effects but often do not, genuine emotional developments are supposed to permanently alter the character who experienced them. Springfield remembers selectively, forgets deliberately, and the characters move through emotional experiences that should be formative and come out the other side essentially unchanged. There is one death in the show's history that created a rule break the show has never resolved, and it is the most important one. Lionel Hutz. Phil Hartman's characters. Phil Hartman voiced Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure, two of the show's most beloved recurring characters, until Hartman's death in 1998. The show's response to his death was immediate and clear. Hutz and McClure were retired. They were not recast. They were not written out with explanations. They simply stopped appearing. Their existence within Springfield's world is now permanently ambiguous. They are characters who existed and then stopped existing without explanation. The rule break here is of a different kind than any we have discussed. It is not the show breaking its internal rules for narrative convenience. It is the real world breaking the show's internal rules through loss. Hutz and McClure are a permanent gap in Springfield's fabric, characters whose absence is never acknowledged within the show's world, but whose absence is continuously felt by anyone who has been watching long enough to remember them. The show's rule about what Springfield contains was broken by grief, and unlike most of the rules we have discussed, there was no way to repair this one. No story device, no narrative convenience, no creative flexibility could address it. The break is permanent, and that permanence makes it the most honest break in the show's history. Every other rule break we have discussed involves the show finding a way to have things it cannot fully justify having. This one is the show accepting, without any creative machinery to soften the impact, that something real was gone and would stay gone. Springfield, for all its forgetting, could not forget Hartman. The absence is written into the show's fabric in the most permanent way possible, by being never mentioned, always present, impossible to resolve. The rule that was broken by his death has not been fixed. It cannot be fixed. It remains broken, quietly, underneath every episode of the show that has aired since 1998. Springfield is located everywhere and nowhere. We have established this. The show's deliberate geographic ambiguity has been a creative choice since the beginning, a way of making Springfield universal. Every town, the town you grew up in, regardless of which state you are from. But the geographic ambiguity is only the most discussed version of a much broader set of rule breaks in what Springfield is as a physical place. The town does not just exist in an ambiguous state relationship. It violates the rules of physical geography, of architectural continuity, of how places develop and change over time, in ways that go significantly beyond the question of which state its power plant is regulated by. Let us start with the town's geography itself, separate from the state question. The rule about Springfield's local geography, the relationship between its landmarks and features, has been established across many episodes and contradicted almost as many times. The location of the power plant relative to downtown Springfield has been depicted in ways that are inconsistent across episodes. The location of the Simpson house relative to the rest of Evergreen Terrace, and Evergreen Terrace's location relative to other parts of Springfield, shifts between episodes in ways that cannot all be true simultaneously. This is partly an animation problem. Different animation teams handling different episodes over 36 years will inevitably produce slightly different versions of the same spaces. The discipline required to maintain perfect geographic consistency across that many episodes made by that many different teams would require a level of coordination that most animation productions, including this one, do not apply. But the extent of the inconsistency in The Simpsons goes beyond what simple animation variants would produce. There are episodes where landmarks appear on the wrong side of town from where they have been previously established. There are episodes where travel times between specific locations change dramatically from what previous episodes implied. There are episodes where geographic features, hills, bodies of water, the gorge that is a recurring Springfield landmark appear in positions inconsistent with their placement in other episodes. Springfield's physical layout is not quite real. It is an impression of a layout, a collection of spatial relationships that feel consistent enough for individual episodes while not holding together across the full catalog. The gorge is worth specific attention because it is one of Springfield's most repeatedly used landmarks and one of its most inconsistently placed. The gorge is deep enough to kill anyone who falls into it. This is established clearly. Characters who fall into the gorge do not survive the fall unless the show specifically needs them to, in which case they survive in ways that the established depth should not allow. The gorge is used as a location for extreme consequences, a place people end up when the story needs dramatic physical stakes. But the gorge's position relative to other Springfield landmarks changes across episodes. In some episodes, it is accessible from specific parts of town in specific amounts of time. In others, it appears at the edge of different neighborhoods or in geographic contexts that do not match previous appearances. This makes the gorge a kind of floating extremity of Springfield, always available to create the kind of dramatic physical stakes it generates, always located wherever the story needs it to be. It is not a specific place in a specific position. It is a story element that happens to have a physical form. The elementary school's location has similar properties. So does the nuclear power plant. So does the center of Springfield's downtown. Each major landmark has a canonical existence. We know what it is, what it looks like, what happens there, but its precise position within Springfield's geography is more variable than the show's overall consistency would suggest. This is not simply animators being imprecise. It is the show treating Springfield's geography the way it treats all of its established facts, as a resource to be drawn on when useful and not rigidly constrained by when it would limit the story. The rules about what is possible within Springfield's physical environment are their own ongoing source of rule-breaking. The show has established that Springfield has weather, normal American weather seasons, precipitation, temperature variation, This rule is applied consistently enough that specific episodes are set in specific seasons, and the visual and narrative details of those episodes reflect the seasonal context. Springfield winters are cold. Springfield summers are hot. The seasons exist and the show uses them. But Springfield's weather has also been used in ways that the seasonal rule cannot accommodate. The town has experienced weather events of a kind that its geographic ambiguity makes contextually strange tornadoes, hurricanes, blizzards, heat waves, flooding events in ways that do not consistently match what any specific real geographic location would experience. This is explicable by Springfield's deliberate everywhere and nowhere quality. If Springfield is every American town, then it can experience any American weather. But it creates a rule about Springfield's physical environment that is maximally flexible, so flexible that it is not quite a rule at all. Springfield can have whatever weather the story needs. The seasonal establishment creates the impression of a rule, while the weather events demonstrate that the rule has no real constraint. The episode-to-episode continuity of Springfield's physical state is another source of ongoing rule-breaking that we addressed in the memory section, but that deserves additional attention here from the perspective of the town itself. Springfield's physical environment, its buildings, its roads, its public spaces is subject to damage in ways that the town cannot consistently rebuild between episodes. A building is destroyed. In the next episode, the building is present. This is the most basic version of the rule break. But there are more interesting versions. The show has sometimes attempted to establish specific physical changes to Springfield as lasting. A new building is constructed, with enough narrative weight that the construction feels like a genuine addition to the show's world. A public space is redesigned in ways that should be visible in subsequent episodes. A business opens or closes in a way that should affect the town's commercial landscape going forward. Some of these changes stick. Springfield has accumulated a genuine record of lasting physical evolution across its run. Certain places exist in later seasons that did not exist in earlier ones. Certain places that existed in earlier seasons are gone in later ones. The town is not completely static, but many of the changes do not stick. The most dramatically established changes, the ones the show invests the most narrative energy in, are sometimes the ones that most completely disappear from subsequent episodes. The change has generated its story, the story has resolved, and the change is no longer necessary for the show's ongoing world, so it fades. The rule being broken is the rule about what physical permanence means. In a real place, buildings that are built remain. Businesses that close stay closed until someone reopens them. The physical environment records what has happened to it. Springfield records selectively, based on what each subsequent episode needs. The Simpsons house is its own small but endlessly interesting catalog of rule-breaking. The Simpson home at 742 Evergreen Terrace is perhaps the most depicted private residence in the history of American television. Its external appearance has been established clearly. Its internal layout has been depicted across hundreds of episodes. But the internal layout is not consistent. Rooms appear in different places in different episodes. The basement has different features depending on which episode is set there. The attic, when it appears, does not always match the dimensions implied by the exterior. The kitchen, living room, and entry hall have a consistent general character. You always know you are in the Simpson house, while the specific spatial relationships between them have shifted across episodes in ways that prevent a fully consistent floor plan from being drawn. This is well documented in fan communities, where attempts to create a definitive floor plan of the Simpson house have been made and have consistently found that the episode evidence cannot be reconciled into a single coherent architectural space. The house is the show's most intimate and most repeatedly visited location, and it is the one whose rules are broken most casually and with the least concern. Because the house's job is not to be a consistent architectural space. Its job is to be the warm, familiar setting where the Simpsons story happens. The specific shape of the kitchen does not matter. The feeling of the kitchen, the specific sense of being in this family's home does. The feeling is preserved. The physical rule is broken. The audience, like Springfield, forgets what the rule was and responds to the feeling. This brings us to the deepest version of Springfield's rule breaking, the one that sits beneath all the geographic and architectural inconsistencies. The rule about what kind of place Springfield is, what it is trying to be, what emotional reality it is trying to produce has been stated and restated across 36 years in ways that are not always compatible with each other. Springfield is every American town. This is the show's foundational claim about its setting. The town is universal, deliberately unspecific, designed to resonate with every viewer regardless of their geographic reality. But Springfield is also a very specific place. The accumulated detail of 36 years of storytelling has made it specific in ways that go beyond what a deliberately universal setting should be. It has a specific history, specific landmarks, specific characters whose existence gives the place a particular texture that is not universal at all. Springfield is as specific as the specific version of itself that 36 years of stories have created. These two rules, Springfield as universal and Springfield as specific, cannot fully coexist. A place cannot be both the general case and the particular instance. The show has tried to have both, and the effort has produced a setting that is neither fully universal nor fully consistent in its specificity. But here is the thing about that failure. It might be the most realistic thing The Simpsons has ever done. Real places are like this. Your hometown is both the specific particular place where you grew up and the universal small American town of cultural imagination. It is both the town with that specific smell and that specific road and that specific diner you still think about, and it is also the stand-in for all the towns you have seen in movies and television that you have layered on top of it over the years. Places in memory do not maintain consistent geographic rules. They are both the real place and the impression of the real place, and the two do not perfectly overlap. The house you grew up in is both the physical structure with a specific floor plan and the felt space of childhood memory, where the rooms are bigger or smaller or differently arranged than they actually are. Springfield is a place constructed the way memory constructs places, not through geometric fidelity but through the accumulation of feelings and details and moments that add up to something that is true even when it is not accurate. This is why the geographic inconsistencies do not damage the show in the way that they would damage a realistic drama. Because the show's relationship to place has never been realistic. It has been emotional. Springfield has always been the town of your memory, rather than the town of your map. And if that is what Springfield is, a place held together by feeling rather than by fact, then the rules about geography and architecture and physical permanence are not the right rules to apply to it. The right rules are the emotional ones. Does this feel like Springfield? Does this feel like home? The answer, 36 years in, for the audience that has been watching since the beginning, and the audience that came in somewhere in the middle, and the audience that discovered the show through streaming and has never seen it in its original broadcast context, is yes. It feels like Springfield. It feels like home. The rules that got broken along the way did not change that. Maybe they were never the rules that mattered. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. Longer than any individual episode, longer than most marathons. We have moved through Homer's impossible body and Marge's rewritten history and Bart's frozen age and Lisa's honored and dishonored intelligence. We have walked through the nuclear plant and examined Mr. Burns's constructed immortality and watched the guest stars arrive in a town whose rules say they should not be there. We have tracked relationships through their richest expressions and their most functional compromises. We have watched Springfield forget. We have watched Springfield remember selectively. We have watched the show break its rules in every direction simultaneously for 36 years. And we are still here. That is the most important thing. Not that the rules were broken, rules in fiction are always somewhat optional, but that the breaking of them could not dissolve the thing that makes the show worth watching. The warmth, the humor, the specific aching quality of affection that the show generates for characters who are both fully themselves and inconsistently themselves, both the same people they have always been and different people depending on what the story needs. The rules that truly hold in The Simpsons are not the factual ones. They are not the rules about Homer's birth year or Bart's grade or where Springfield sits on a map. The rules that hold are the ones that were never written down and never needed to be. Homer loves his family in a way that is total and inarticulate and expressed through choices that are frequently terrible and occasionally perfect. Marge holds on, not because she has no other options, because she has decided that this is her life, and these are her people, and she is going to love them completely even when they make it very hard. Bart is not going to stop being who he is. He was 10 when the show started. He is 10 now. He will be 10 when it ends. And in that 10-year-old existence, he has found ways to be more genuinely alive than most characters in more realistic shows manage to be across decades of aging. Lisa is going to keep asking the questions nobody else wants to ask. She is going to be frustrated that the answers do not come faster. She is going to play the saxophone and miss the note sometimes, and hit it sometimes and keep playing, because playing is what she has. Maggie is watching. She is always watching. And Springfield is going to keep being everywhere and nowhere, subject to floods and sinkings and dome coverage and geological inconsistency, populated by people who are yellow and four-fingered and who survive things that should kill them and forget things that should define them. The plant is going to keep running with its violations unaddressed. Mr. Burns is going to keep living through treatments that should not work. The rules are going to keep getting broken, every episode, in ways big and small, visible and invisible, intentional and accidental. And the show is going to keep being The Simpsons. Because the rules that matter, the ones about who these people are to each other at their best, the ones about what this show can do when it remembers what it is for those rules have never been broken. Not in 36 years. Not once. Everything else is negotiable. The rest is Springfield. And Springfield, inconsistent and rule-breaking and forgetful and strange as it is, will always be exactly where you left it. Just past the opening credits. Just past the couch gag. Just past the music that means you are home. It is always there. That is the whole point. Good night, or good morning, wherever you are, whatever time the clock says. Thank you for staying in Springfield with me. If you are still awake, then you know something about what this show is, what it does to the people who love it. It keeps you here, even at the edges of sleep, even when the logic is fraying and the rules are soft and the geography does not hold. It keeps you here. That is the one thing it has never broken.